I only needed shelter. But this cabin had been waiting for someone like me.
She was 24 and bankrupt. No apartment, no savings, no wedding dress, just a cracked thermos and $8 she had earned by cleaning trout guts from a motel freezer after midnight. And with that money, she bought a moss-swallowed fly-tying cabin outside Gallatin Gateway, Gallatin County, Montana, a place that had fallen off township maps in 1987. The north wall leaned 3 inches out of plumb. Snow came through 2 seams in the cedar shake roof. The county had condemned it since 2009 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that beneath the false bottom of a hand-rubbed maple tackle chest, in a hidden compartment that had not been opened in over 31 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sadie Elaine Whitcomb had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. She had left rooms before her name was called. She had left supper tables while the grown people were still talking in their careful lowered voices. She had left school dances, early church basements after pie suppers, grocery aisles when a cashier frowned too long at the coins in her palm. By the time she was old enough to understand the habit, it had already settled in her bones like a weather ache. Her childhood had been made of borrowed corners, a narrow bedroom in a rented duplex near Livingston, where the wind worried the window frame all winter, a back porch where her mother kept bags of flour in a tin cabinet because mice had learned the kitchen, a fold-out cot in a cousin's den during the year the furnace failed and money went toward pipes instead of heat. Sadie learned early that a person could own almost nothing and still be expected to keep it neat. She folded her socks in pairs, even when the toes were thin enough to show skin. She washed jam jars and used them for pencils. She kept school papers flat beneath a dictionary with a cracked spine, because wrinkled pages made teachers look at her in a way she could not bear. In the evenings, when other children were driven to piano lessons or basketball practice, she sat at the Formica table and drew cabins in the margins of spelling worksheets. Not grand houses. Never that. She drew single rooms with stovepipes, plank floors, hooks for coats, windows that faced water, shelves that held jars of beans and nails and buttons sorted by colour. In those drawings, every item had a place. Every latch worked. Every roof kept the weather out. Her mother, Marlene, had once been a woman who sang while washing dishes. Sadie could remember that, though the memory was faint and worn thin from being held too often. Marlene had a soft alto voice and a way of pinning her hair with 2 bobby pins while turning biscuits in a pan. She smelled of ivory soap, coffee, and the cheap hand lotion she used after cleaning rooms at a guest lodge off the highway. In Sadie's earliest years, Marlene was always moving. She changed beds, wiped mirrors, folded towels into shapes that made vacationers feel welcomed. She came home with red hands and a paper bag of supper rolls that would have been thrown away. She never complained in front of her daughter. She only stood sometimes at the sink after dark, one hand on the edge, listening to water run as if there were a message in it. Sadie's father was more absence than man. His name appeared on one faded hospital bracelet, kept in a shoebox with baby teeth and school photographs. He had worked pipeline jobs from Wyoming down through Utah, sending money twice and postcards once, then nothing. Marlene never cursed him. She did not defend him either when Sadie asked at 7 whether he had died. Her mother took too long drying a plate. No, Marlene said. Some people just keep going. After that, Sadie stopped asking. The person who did not keep going, not at first, was her grandfather's brother, Emmett Vale. He was not blood by the strict lines most families used, but he was kin by repetition, by Sunday rides, by the way he remembered Sadie's birthday without being reminded. He lived in a weathered cabin near the Madison River, where cottonwoods leaned over the banks and the light in late afternoon turned the current, the colour of pewter. Emmett was a fly-tier, though he never said it with pride. He said it the way another man might say he repaired harness or sharpened knives. It was work of the hand, work of the eye, work that did not tolerate hurry. He had guided fishermen when his knees were stronger. Men from back east with clean waders and expensive reels. Men who wanted trout large enough to photograph and stories large enough to carry home. In winter, when guiding money thinned, he tied flies by the dozen and sold them in small waxed packets to outfitters from Bozeman to Ennis. Sadie spent weekends with him from the age of 9 until almost 18. Marlene would drop her off on Saturday morning in a car that coughed blue at the tailpipe, and Emmett would be waiting by the door with his wool cap pulled low and one hand wrapped around a mug. He never asked too many questions. He took the paper sack of groceries Marlene brought, nodded once, and said there was coffee if she wanted it. Marlene almost always refused, not sharply, but with that same hurried sorrow she carried like a purse. Inside Emmett's cabin, there were 3 kinds of silence. There was morning silence, when the stove was building heat and the windows held frost in white feathers. There was river silence, wide and moving, full of water over stone. And there was tying silence, the most exact silence Sadie had ever known. Emmett's tying bench stood beneath a south window. It was made from 2 filing cabinets and a plank of scarred maple rubbed smooth by elbows. Above it hung little drawers labelled in his narrow hand: mallard flank, elk hair, peacock herl, red floss, grizzly hackle, dun, ginger, badger, partridge. Hooks lay in glass vials no longer than a finger. Threads were arranged by colour, fine as hair. There were brass scissors with finger holes polished bright, a whip finisher, bobbins, bodkins, hackle pliers, wax, head cement, and a magnifying lamp that made everything beneath it appear sacred. Sadie's ritual began the same way each visit. She swept the floor around the bench with a hand broom, saving any dropped feather that was still clean. She filled the kettle. She set 2 slices of bread near the stove to toast. Then she sat on the stool beside Emmett and waited for him to choose the first pattern of the day. He taught without softening the work. Thread base first, he would say. So she laid thread from behind the eye to above the barb, each turn touching the last, not too much dubbing. So she pinched a grey wisp between thumb and finger until it looked like almost nothing. Let the feather decide. So she learned not to fight the curve of hackle, not to force elk hair to be deer hair, not to make a mayfly out of materials that wanted to become a caddis. There were patterns with names that sounded to her like small weather systems: blue-winged olive, pale morning dun, royal wolf, elk hair caddis, pheasant tail, prince nymph, muddler minnow, soft hackle March brown. Emmett told her when to fish each one, though he seldom took her fishing, until she could tie it cleanly enough to deserve the river's attention. On Sundays after lunch he would open his maple tackle chest. It was older than anything else in the cabin, with dovetailed corners, a brass clasp and a lid darkened by years of palm oil and rain. He kept his best flies inside, each row held in cream-coloured wool. Sometimes he let Sadie choose one and copy it. Sometimes he closed the lid and said a person should not spend the whole Sabbath trying to trick a trout. The quote she never forgot came on a February afternoon when snow had covered the road and the world outside the window had gone white enough to erase distance. Sadie was 12, tired and angry at a row of size 22 midges that would not come right. She had snapped thread twice and bent one hook at the eye. Emmett took the ruined fly from the vise and set it in her palm. "A careful thing does not have to be large to matter," he said. He did not explain it then. He did not need to. The sentence entered her the way stove heat enters a cold sleeve, slowly without announcing itself. Years later, when money was loud and debt was louder, she would remember the weightless hook in her hand and the old man's voice making a doctrine out of patience. Emmett died in October, when the cottonwoods had gone yellow and the trout were holding deep. A stroke took him in the grocery aisle of a market in Belgrade, between sacks of flour and cans of peaches. A woman from church stood with him until the ambulance came. Sadie was 19 by then, working breakfast shifts at a cafe and taking night classes in hospitality management, because she had begun to dream of a modest eco-camp beside water. Nothing loud, nothing false, only canvas tents, clean food, and mornings built around weather. By the time she reached Emmett's cabin, A distant cousin had already been through it with boxes. The tying bench was stripped. The drawers were gone. The magnifying lamp had been unscrewed and taken. The maple tackle chest, the brass scissors, the hand-labelled materials, the old guide ledgers with river notes and hatch dates. All of it had vanished into someone's truck before she could ask where it was going. What remained were dust rectangles on the wall and a few clipped feathers caught in the floorboards. Sadie knelt and picked up a single piece of peacock herl. It shimmered green in her palm. Useless and beautiful. At the funeral, people told stories about Emmett's patience, his dry humour, his knowledge of water. They said he had been one of the last of a certain breed. They said the younger generation did not have time for handwork like that anymore. Sadie stood near the back in a black dress borrowed from her mother and listened to them praise what none of them had thought to preserve. Afterward, Marlene married Grant Peller. Grant was not a shouting man, which made him harder to describe honestly. He wore square-toed shoes and pressed jeans with a crease. He shaved every morning and smelled of bay rum. He worked in used equipment sales along the I-90 corridor and had a salesman's talent for entering a room as if he had already measured it. He did not break dishes. He did not slam doors. He did not leave bruises. He altered the air. When Grant sat at the table, Marlene stopped singing. When he opened mail, he made a little clicking sound with his tongue. When Sadie spoke of taking a loan to lease river frontage someday, he smiled with only one side of his mouth and said banks admired collateral more than dreams. He called her plans sweet in a tone that made the word feel damp and spoiled. At first, he seemed to approve of Sadie's fiancé, Nolan Price. Nolan had clean fingernails, a degree in outdoor recreation management, and a way of talking to investors as if friendship were already paperwork. He listened when Sadie described her eco-camp idea. He helped her build spreadsheets, design a logo, draft a 5-year plan. He said her vision had market value. And because he said it while touching the back of her hand, she mistook the phrase for belief. Sadie worked 3 jobs to feed that vision. Breakfast service at the cafe, evening desk shifts at a roadside inn, weekend cleaning for rental cabins near Big Sky, where tourists left damp towels, half bottles of wine, and pamphlets for adventures she could not afford. She saved in envelopes, then in a joint account Nolan said would look more professional when they approached lenders. He filed forms, he bought domain names, he met with a lawyer in Bozeman and told her not to worry over the language. Legal wording is just thicket, he said. I'll walk us through. By late autumn, the business had a name, a proposal, and 6 tentative private investors. It also had Nolan's signature on everything that mattered. The leaving happened before the wedding, not after. Sadie came home from a double shift on November 14th and found the apartment stripped of his equipment, his clothes, his camping catalogues, and the framed photograph from their engagement beside Hyalite Reservoir. On the kitchen counter lay a manila envelope, a stack of overdue notices, and a silver key she had given him when the lease was renewed. The envelope contained copies of business filings under Nolan's name alone. There were credit card statements she did not recognize, a notice from the bank about the emptied account, a letter from the venue refusing to return the deposit, and 2 invoices addressed to her because she had been foolish enough to sign where he pointed. At the bottom was a sheet of yellow legal paper. 8 words, written in Nolan's exact upright hand. You trusted me more than the paperwork, Sadie. Marlene stood in the doorway while Sadie read it. She held a dish towel against her chest, twisted once around her fingers. Grant was behind her in the hall, not touching her, not speaking. The apartment heater ticked in the wall. Outside, a delivery truck backed somewhere in the lot, its warning beeps coming through the glass in even merciless intervals. Sadie looked at her mother first. There are betrayals that make noise and betrayals that simply fail to move. Marlene did not cross the room. She did not take the paper. She did not say that they would find a lawyer, or a couch, or a way through. Her eyes went once to Grant, then down to the floor, where a small crescent of mud from Sadie's boot had dried near the mat. "You cannot stay here," Grant said, very gently. On November 17th, the landlord came with a clipboard and a patience that had been professionally exhausted. Sadie put her clothes into 2 black trash bags, her work shoes into a cardboard wine box, and Emmett's one surviving photograph into the glove compartment of her truck. The photograph showed him at the tying bench, head bent, magnifier light shining on his hands. The maple chest was visible in the lower corner, blurred and ordinary, like something a person assumes will always be there. Marlene stood beside Grant at the bottom of the stairs. Sadie carried the last bag herself. A wool glove fell from the top and landed on the wet concrete. Her mother bent, picked it up, brushed off grit with her thumb, and held it out. For 1 second, their hands touched. Then Marlene let go. Sadie slept that night in the cab of her 1998 Ford Ranger behind a closed laundromat in Livingston. The truck smelled of stale coffee, cold vinyl, and the pine air freshener Nolan had hung from the mirror the previous summer. She had $43.16, half a tank of gas, 1 thermos, 2 granola bars, and a tire that lost air slowly in freezing weather. 6 weeks can be a long country. She learned the places a person could park without being noticed. Behind the Livingston Library, where the outdoor light stayed on until dawn, near the fairgrounds in Bozeman, tucked between horse trailers after a weekend event, in Belgrade beside a self-service car wash where the concrete bays blocked the wind if she backed in close. Once, outside Three Forks, she slept in the truck bed beneath a blue tarp because the cab would not warm and her legs cramped so badly she had to lie flat. She drove only when necessary. Gas fell from half a tank to a quarter, then hovered there like a warning. She applied for work where she could walk in clean enough to be considered. Diners, motel desks, a feed store, a warehouse that wanted seasonal packers but required an address. She washed in library bathrooms with paper towels. She dried her socks over the dashboard vents when the engine ran. She ate day-old rolls from a bakery that set a paper sack by the back door after closing. Never with a note, always tied twice. By the 2nd week, she had sold her engagement shoes at a consignment shop in Bozeman for $12. By the 3rd, she had pawned a small gold chain Marlene had given her at graduation. By the 4th, she had stopped checking whether Nolan had replied to any messages because unanswered words cost a person more than pride. The cold became a schedule. At 9 in the evening, breath began frosting the inside of the windshield. By midnight, her toes lost their edges. At 3, she woke to pain in her fingers if she had curled them wrong. Near dawn, the whole truck seemed to shrink around her, metal holding the night in its skin. She kept Emmett's photograph tucked into the sun visor, not because it helped in any practical way, but because his bent head reminded her that a person could still make careful turns when the world offered only thread and hook. In Bozeman, she found the public library almost by accident, after walking 3 miles from a temporary parking spot near North Rouse Avenue, because she did not want to waste fuel starting the truck. The building was warm in a public, guarded way. Heat moved through vents in the floor. Children whispered near picture books. A man in a knit cap slept over a newspaper until a librarian touched the table and asked him, not unkindly, to sit up. Sadie took a chair near the local history shelves. She went there first for warmth, then for the restroom, then for internet access when a computer opened. She searched for winter work, debt counseling, free legal clinics, low-income housing, shelters with available beds. The lists were long and somehow still closed. She wrote phone numbers on the back of a grocery receipt with a pencil from the reference desk. On the bulletin board near the entrance, among tutoring cards, lost pet notices, grief groups, and a flyer for fiddle lessons. There was a county surplus notice printed on pale green paper. Structure auction, non-conforming rural property. Gallatin County Clerk's Office. Sealed disposal of condemned accessory structure and associated parcel remnant. Minimum bid $8. Buyer responsible for all liability. Taxes. Access. Repair. And demolition compliance. Former guide cabin. Fly fishing use. No utilities confirmed. Gallatin Gateway vicinity. Auction closes December 29th at 4 p.m. Sadie read the notice once standing up. Then she took it down carefully, carried it to a table, and read it again with both hands flat beside the paper. The words should have been a warning: condemned, liability, no utilities, demolition compliance. Each one had a hard edge. Each one meant money she did not have, skills she only partly possessed, and responsibilities that could bury a person already low. But below the typed notice, in smaller print, someone had added a photocopied image from an older county file. The picture showed a low log structure with a stone chimney, a plank door, and a sign so weathered the letters were nearly gone. Yet Sadie could read enough. Vale Guide Service, flies tied, river maps. Her hands went still. The library around her continued in its patient ordinary way. A printer clicked. A child laughed once and was hushed. Boots crossed tile near the circulation desk. Outside the high windows, late December light thinned over Bozeman's rooftops, and the bridges stood blue and cold beyond town. Sadie looked from the photograph to Emmett's picture, which she had taken from the truck, and kept folded in her coat pocket after the lock on the passenger door began sticking. The surname was the same, not rare but not common enough to ignore: a guide cabin, a fly-tying room, a structure unwanted by the county and nearly erased by weather. She had $8 left, not $8 and change, 8 exact dollars folded once in the smallest pocket of her jeans, because she had spent the last coins that morning on coffee she made last 3 hours. The money was supposed to buy gas enough to move the truck before the next parking complaint found her windshield. She sat with the notice until the library lights seemed to brighten against the coming dark. A practical person would have walked away. A person with family would have called someone. A person who believed rescue arrived by ordinary routes would have put the green paper back and gone on searching for rooms, vouchers, waiting lists, numbers that rang to voicemail. Sadie folded the notice along its original crease. The decision did not come like courage. It came more like exhaustion laid down in a straight line. She was tired of begging systems to decide whether she was desperate enough, tired of explaining debts with a stranger's name hidden beneath them, tired of being told that shelter required forms, employment required an address, and an address required money that could not be earned without shelter. An unwanted cabin did not promise kindness. It promised only weather, liability, and a door that might still close. The next morning, before sunrise, Sadie drove the Ranger as far as she dared, stopping twice to put air in the soft tire, and once to sit in a gas station restroom until warmth returned to her hands. She parked 3 blocks from the Gallatin County building and walked the rest of the way with the green notice inside her coat and Emmett's photograph in her pocket. Snow had fallen overnight, not enough to cover the curbs, only enough to make the streets look temporarily forgiven. The sky over Bozeman was low and colourless. Trucks moved past with chains ticking softly against ice. Somewhere a church bell rang 9 times, each note fading before the next took hold. Sadie climbed the county steps with $8 in her palm. Behind her lay the truck, the debt letters, the lost apartment, the mother who had not moved, and the man who had turned trust into paperwork. Ahead of her waited a clerk's counter. A brass stamp, a road out toward Gallatin Gateway, and a condemned fly-tying cabin nobody had wanted enough to save. The bus hissed at the curb before daylight and opened its folding door into air, sharp enough to make every waiting person lower their face. Sadie climbed aboard with 1 trash bag of clothing, 1 cardboard box tied with clothesline, and the sort of careful balance that comes when a person owns so little that dropping anything would change the day. The driver did not ask where she was headed until she stood beside the fare box. Gallatin Gateway. If you go that far, she said. He looked at the box, then at her coat, then at the paper she had folded into the clear sleeve of an old motel keycard. Not direct, he said. I can get you near 4 Corners. After that, you walk. She nodded because nodding cost nothing, and because all winter she had learned that help often came in half measures. A bench, not a bed, coffee, not breakfast, directions, not a ride. She dropped the last of her coins into the fare box and sat halfway down the aisle, where the heater under the seat rasped against her boots and made the wet hems of her jeans steam faintly. Outside Bozeman, the morning had no colour yet. The Bridger Mountains stood to the north with their shoulders hidden in cloud. Snow lay in the ditches in wind-shaped crusts, grey at the edges from road grit. The bus passed gas stations just opening, a pawn shop with barred windows, storage units lined in identical doors, and a veterinary clinic where a man in a wool hat shovelled the front walk with slow, resigned strokes. Her cardboard box held all that she was unwilling to lose. 2 shirts, 1 flannel nightgown, a tin cup, a library pencil, a packet of debt letters she had stopped reading but could not yet throw away, the photograph of the old tying bench wrapped now in a dish towel, a pair of socks dried stiff overnight and folded into a sandwich bag. Nothing in the box looked like the beginning of a life. At 4 corners. The driver stopped beside a snowbank hardened by ploughs and pointed through the windshield. Road bends southwest. Keep the traffic facing you. Weather says 16 degrees now. Maybe colder by noon with the wind. Thank you, she said. He shut the door after her, and the bus moved on with a sigh of warm diesel, leaving her beside the road under a sky the colour of dull pewter. 16 degrees, he had said. The number settled in her ears the way a rule might. Not the worst cold she had known. Not safe either. She walked the shoulder with the box against her hip and the trash bag over one shoulder like a dark, awkward wing. Cars gave her room when they could. Trucks lifted snow dust in small, hard bursts. A magpie flew from a fence post to a cottonwood and scolded the morning as if it had been personally offended by the weather. 2 miles became 3. At the 4th mile the clothesline cut into her fingers, and she stopped near a mailbox leaning from its post to shift the box to the other arm. The ditch beside her held cattails bent under ice. Beyond it, winter pasture rolled out toward low ranch buildings, and horses stood with their backs to the wind, each one wearing a faint rim of frost along the mane. By late morning, her breath had dampened the scarf across her mouth, then frozen it at the edge. She counted telephone poles to keep from counting what she had lost. 20 poles, rest. 20 more, drink 1 mouthful from the thermos. 20 more, keep moving. Her boots were not made for long walking. They were work shoes with soles polished by kitchen tile and motel corridors. The road asked more of them than they had been built to give. She did not reach the clerk's office first. She reached the town. Gallatin Gateway came slowly into view, not as an announcement, but as a gathering of practical places along the road. There was the Gallatin Gateway Inn, broad and pale against the winter sky, its old railroad dignity softened by snow along the eaves. There was a Sinclair station with green trim and a bell hose darkened by slush. There was a post office with an American flag snapping stiffly in the wind. There was a fly shop with painted trout on its sign and rods standing in the window like bundled reeds. There was a cafe with fogged glass, a chalkboard menu and 2 pickup trucks outside with engine blocks still ticking. Across from the cafe, a feed and seed store had sacks of mineral salt stacked under the awning. Beside it sat a narrow antique shop closed for the season, its window crowded with washboards, lanterns, and a child's sled turned silver with age. Smoke rose from one chimney in town, then another, making small grey signatures in the cold. Sadie stopped under the awning of the feed store and set down the box. Her arms trembled after she released it. Not from fear. Not exactly. From distance. From hunger. From the body's honest accounting. She flexed her fingers inside her gloves until pain returned in pins and sparks. The fly shop window held more colour than anything else on the street. Rows of tied patterns lay beneath glass, each one small enough to be lost in a cuff, each one exact enough to make her lean closer despite herself. Elk hair trimmed at clean angles, mallard flank married to bright thread, copper wire ribbing wrapped in even turns. A pheasant-tail nymph with legs so fine they seemed breathed into place. Whoever tied them knew not only how an insect looked, but how water asked a thing to move. The sight touched something in her, and she stepped back from the window before the storekeeper could notice her looking poor. The county business itself was not handled from that street, though the surplus notice had given directions for final deed processing at a Gallatin County satellite counter set inside an annex building used 2 days a week for rural filings, tax questions and public notices. The building stood behind the post office, square and plain, with a ramp shoveled clean and a brass plaque beside the door dulled by weather. Inside, heat pressed against her face. The entry smelled of floor wax, toner, damp wool and coffee burned down too long on a warming plate. Fluorescent lights hummed above a row of plastic chairs. A bulletin board carried snowmobile access rules, burn permit dates, brand inspection reminders, and a notice about ice jams along the Gallatin River. Somewhere in the back, a printer worked in steady bursts, pausing between pages as if considering each one. Sadie stood on the mat until her boots stopped shedding snow. The clerk's counter was made of oak veneer, worn pale where elbows had rested through years of waiting. Behind it, file cabinets rose in grey columns. A calendar from an insurance agency showed a September photograph of golden aspens, though the current month had been marked by hand with black X's. Near the corner sat an old brass stamp with a wooden handle shaped by use. The woman at the desk lifted her eyes over half-moon glasses. She had iron-grey hair braided and pinned at the back of her head, a narrow face and hands that looked more suited to quilting than county paperwork, though they moved with authority over every folder they touched. Her blouse was buttoned to the throat beneath a brown cardigan. The nameplate on the counter read, MRS, Luella Baines, Deputy Clerk. Not Luella. Not L. Baines. Mrs. Luella Baines. As if the desk itself preferred complete names. "Can I help you?" she said. Sadie took the green notice from inside her coat and smoothed it on the counter. The paper had gone soft at the creases from being handled too many times. "I came about the surplus structure." Mrs. Baines looked at the notice, then at Sadie's box, then at the trash bag beside her boot. Her gaze did not pity. "It measured—" "That closed yesterday." Sadie's hand tightened once on the counter edge. "I left the bid envelope in Bozeman before 4, she said. "They told me to come here for processing if there were no other bidders." The clerk turned in her chair, opened a metal tray, and sorted through a stack of envelopes with a practiced thumb. The room became very still while she looked. Sadie heard a clock tick somewhere above the copier. She heard her own breath pass through the scarf around her neck. The clerk found a cream envelope, slit along the top and removed a half-sheet with a receipt stapled to it. "Only bid received, Mrs." Baines said. Sadie did not answer. The clerk looked at her again, longer this time, then reached for a brown file. "You understand this is not a house in any ordinary sense?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no confirmed well permit attached to the active parcel record?" "Yes." Ma'am. "You understand the electric service was disconnected years ago, and the utility company may require inspection before reconnection?" "Yes." Ma'am. "You understand the county condemnation notice remains unless repairs are documented before the deadline?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand access in winter is not maintained beyond the main road, and if you get stuck, the county is not obliged to come pull you out?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there may be animals inside? Raccoons, mice, bats if the chimney cap failed. I have seen all 3 in places better kept than that one." "Yes, ma'am." "Mrs." Baines drew the file closer, but she did not open it yet. She folded her hands on top of the folder. "You understand, Miss Whitcomb, that buying something for almost nothing does not mean it will cost almost nothing." Sadie looked at the brass stamp. At the ink pad beside it. At the clerk's exact hands. Yes. "Ma'am," she said. "I understand that best." The answer seemed to pass some small gate between them. "Mrs." Baines opened the folder. The deed papers were fewer than Sadie expected and heavier than she deserved. There were legal descriptions in language that felt less like ownership than a weather report written by a surveyor. Section lines, parcel remnants, easement notes, non-conforming structure, responsibility assumed, no warranty expressed or implied. She signed wherever the clerk placed a yellow tab, using a county pen chained to the counter with a little brass bead chain that clicked each time she moved. The clerk watched every signature. When the final page was turned, Mrs. Baines took the folded bills Sadie offered and smoothed them once before placing them in a narrow receipt drawer. She typed slowly, 2 fingers striking the keys with deliberate certainty. The printer awakened, gave its mechanical cough, and pushed out 3 sheets. The clerk tore one loose, stamped it with the old brass stamp, and the sound landed on the counter like a small hammer. Received. Gallatin County. Mrs. Baines signed beneath it in blue ink. Then she stamped the deed copy. The brass handle rose and fell again, leaving its round seal in purple ink, slightly uneven at the edge. Sadie watched the mark dry. It was not beautiful. It was not grand. Yet it was the first official mark in months that did not accuse her of owing something. "Directions, Mrs." Baines said, pulling a county road map from a drawer. She turned it around so Sadie could see. "You go south toward the river, then west off Mill Street until it loses pavement. There is an old ranch lane past the Cottonwood Bend. You will pass a white mailbox with no number and a cattle guard half sunk on the left. Do not take that. Keep on until you see 2 walnut trees grown together at the shoulder. The track beyond them is yours by recorded access, though I would not call it a driveway." She marked the map with a pencil. "Quarter mile in, if snow is not drifted. Longer if it is. Cabin sits low, near the creek. You may miss it from the road because the willows have taken the front." Sadie studied the line. It seemed thin for a road that could now decide where she slept. "Thank you." The clerk closed the folder but kept one finger resting on it. "That name," she said. Sadie looked up. "Ma'am, Whitcomb I know well enough. But the notice says the old guide cabin was once held under a Vale lease, back when the railroad hotel still sent fishermen by wagon. Your mother's people from around here." Sadie's mouth went dry in a way that had nothing to do with thirst. "Some," she said. "Mrs." Baines leaned back slightly, searching memory rather than files. "There was a riverman with that name. Tide flies clean as anyone in the valley. My late husband had a row of his green drakes. He would not fish because he said losing one would be a sin." Sadie's glove found the edge of the cardboard box at her feet. "He taught me when I was young," she said. The clerk's face changed only a little. The sternness did not leave, but something beneath it rearranged itself into recognition. "Well, Mrs." Baines said, "that explains why you looked at the fly shop window as if it had spoken." Sadie did not know what to do with being seen so accurately. "Mrs." Baines opened another drawer and removed a plain manila envelope. On it, in county handwriting, someone had written, "K's, surplus structure, gateway vicinity." She shook out one blackened key and one smaller brass key, both tied to a paper tag with twine. The padlock key may not work. The hasp may not exist anymore. The door key is original, according to the file, though I would not put faith in that either. She set the keys on the counter. Then, after a pause, she took the first receipt from the drawer and placed the folded bills beneath a paperweight shaped like a trout. "I will enter payment after lunch," she said. "No need to watch me count what has already been counted." It was a kindness so dry it could pass as procedure. Sadie gathered the deed copy, the map, and the keys. She put them in the inside pocket of her coat and buttoned it once, then twice, though the second button was cracked and held only if persuaded. At the door, Mrs. Baines spoke again. "Miss Whitcomb," Sadie turned. "If the chimney draws, use it small at first." Old flues dislike being reminded of their purpose too quickly. "Yes, ma'am. And do not sleep directly under the roof valley. I saw the assessor photographs." Sadie nodded. Outside, the cold had strengthened. The town looked clearer now, as if every edge had been sharpened while she was inside. The cafe windows were brighter. A man in a canvas coat came out of the post office carrying seed catalogues under one arm. The fly shop door opened and closed, releasing a brief smell of varnish, wool, and river mud from someone's boots. She did not go in. She took the marked map from her pocket and began walking. The route left the modest centre of town quickly, past the last business. The road narrowed between pasture fences and bare-limbed trees. The Gallatin River did not show itself at first, but she could hear it in places, a cold, crowded sound beneath ice shelves and snow-laden banks. The road surface changed from ploughed asphalt to a pale, hard-packed lane where gravel showed in strips like old bone. A ranch house stood back from the road with smoke lifting from a metal chimney and a row of antlers fixed over the porch. A woman in a red parka carried feed buckets toward a pen and glanced once toward Sadie without waving. Farther on, a blue heeler ran along a fence line, barking with professional suspicion, then gave up when she did not approach the gate. The dog's breath came in white bursts. Its paws threw powder into the air. Walnut trees appeared where Mrs. Baines had said they would. They were not large in the eastern sense, not the broad, generous shade trees Sadie had seen in old farm photographs, but mountain-hardened and bent by weather, their trunks dark and ridged, their branches twisting toward one another over the shoulder of the road. Two had grown so close that their upper limbs touched, making a narrow black arch against the snow sky. Beneath them, half buried in drifted powder, a track turned away from the road. Sadie stopped. The track was not welcoming. It was two sunken ruts filled with snow, willow stems crowding both sides, rabbit tracks crossing at angles, and one strand of rusted wire hanging loose from a leaning post. The key tag in her pocket pressed against her ribs. She shifted the box higher against her hip and stepped into the first rut. Snow entered her shoe almost at once. The quarter mile took longer than any mile she had walked that day. The track dipped, rose, and dipped again. Beneath the snow, frozen mud held ridges hard enough to twist her ankles. Willows snagged the trash bag and once tore it open enough that a sleeve slipped out and dragged behind her until she stopped to retie the knot. Twice she had to set the box down and stand with both hands on her knees, while the wind worked along the back of her neck. Then the willows thinned. At first, she saw only the chimney. It rose from a low roof line in a stack of river stone and handmade brick, tilted slightly but still upright, blackened at the top where weather had worried the mortar. Around it snow lay thick on cedar shakes, except where two dark seams had opened near the ridge. The cabin itself sat in a shallow fold of land above a narrow creek, half hidden by alder willow and the long-dead stems of summer grass. Moss climbed the lower logs in green-black patches. Frost silvered the chinking. One corner rested on stones that had shifted, leaving the structure subtly bowed, as if it had carried a burden without complaint. It was smaller than the photograph had made it seem. 22 feet long perhaps, and 14 deep, with a low front room and a lean-to back room added later under a sloping roof. The walls were squared logs hand-hewn, their tool marks visible where moss had not claimed them. The roof was cedar shake, aged to charcoal and brown, patched once with tin near the chimney. A single 4-pane window faced the track, 2 panes cracked, one missing entirely and covered from inside by warped cardboard. The door was plank, cross-braced, hung on strap hinges red with rust. Above the door, under a lip of roof, the sign still hung. Vale Guide Service, hand-tied flies, River Maps. The letters were flaked almost to ghosts. The board itself had split at one end, and a wasp nest, empty for winter, clung to the underside like grey paper lace. Sadie stood before it without moving. No welcome mat, no clear path, no porch wide enough for a chair, only a flat stone before the door, east at the edges, and one iron hook screwed into the log wall where perhaps a lantern had once hung. She set down the box on the stone and brushed snow from the padlock with her sleeve. The first key did not fit because the padlock was gone. The hasp hung open, one screw missing, the other loose enough to move under her thumb. The door itself was swollen tight. She tried the brass key anyway, guiding it into the lock beneath the latch plate. It entered halfway and stopped. She breathed on it, wiped it, tried again. The metal resisted, then slipped deeper with a tiny inward fall. She turned it. Nothing. The lock had not moved in years, and it made that plain. She rocked the key carefully, afraid of breaking it, feeling for any small consent inside. Once. Twice. On the third try, the mechanism gave a dry click so quiet that she almost missed it. The door still would not open. Sadie put her shoulder against the plank and pushed. The wood groaned, snow fell from the lintel onto her hair. She pushed again, lower this time, with both hands flat near the brace. Something inside scraped the floor. The gap widened an inch, then cold air came out, but it was different from the air outside, older, held. She stepped in sideways. The smell met her first. Mice, dust, gold ashes, dry cedar, damp wool, iron, and a faint sweet rot where leaves had blown in and softened near the sill. Beneath those lay another scent. So thin she might have invented it if she had not known it once. Head cement, waxed thread, feathers kept too long in closed drawers, the ghost of careful work. The front room was barely a room by ordinary standards. A stone hearth took most of the left wall, its firebox black and filled with fallen mortar, mouse droppings and a bird's nest collapsed into twigs. Beside it stood a narrow iron stove with one missing foot propped on a brick. The stovepipe rose crookedly into the chimney thimble, sealed around the edge with cracked clay. Against the opposite wall was a built-in bench beneath the window, its lid warped but still closed. Two shelves held nothing but a tin plate, a brown bottle, a rusted lantern, and a row of acorn caps some animal had placed there with more diligence than a human. The floor was pine plank, cupped by damp and darkened along the centre path. It complained under her first step, not loudly, but with a different note than the threshold. She marked the sound without meaning to. The habit of listening had returned before thought could catch it. The back room opened through a low doorway. She ducked beneath the lintel and found a workspace narrow enough that a tall person would have disliked it. One window faced the creek, its glass clouded but unbroken. Beneath it sat a bench built into the wall, not the bench from the photograph, but kin to it. Maple plank, scarred surface, peg holes where tools once hung, small drawers on either side, most missing pulls, one hanging open. Above the bench, nailed to a beam, were penciled hatch notes in a hand faded by time. March browns, watch water temp. Caddis at dusk after warm wind. Do not overdress. Low water flies. Sadie lifted one hand but did not touch the writing. A split cane rod hung from two wooden pegs overhead, missing its tip. On the floor beneath the bench lay a scatter of old hooks, silvered with rust, a cracked spool, 3 moth-eaten feathers, and a length of yellowed silk thread tangled around a nail. In the corner stood a maple chest with a curved lid. Not large, not ornate, half covered by an oilcloth, stiffened with dust. She saw it. Then she looked away. The body has its own mercy. It knows when a person cannot receive another thing, even a good one. She was too cold, too hungry, too tired from the walk and the papers and the clerk's measured warnings. If she let herself cross the room toward that chest, memory would rise too quickly, and she did not have the strength to stand under it. She returned to the front room. The first work was not discovery. It was survival. She dragged the torn trash bag inside. She brought in the box. She shut the door as far as it would go and wedged the loose hasp through a bent nail to keep the wind from pressing it open. The missing window pane had been covered with cardboard from a feed sack. She found where it had curled away and pushed it flat with the tin plate, then tore a strip from the trash bag and tucked it along the edge to slow the draft. Light entered unevenly. The front window gave a grey square. The back room window held a thinner glow from the creek side. Dust moved in both lights, slow and deliberate, as if the room had been waiting to show its breath. She did not dare build a fire yet. Mrs. Baines had warned her about the flue, and the hearth looked as if it could send smoke into the room faster than heat. Instead, Sadie put on both shirts from the box, then the flannel nightgown over her clothes, then her coat again. She took a granola bar from the pocket where she had saved it for an emergency and ate it in 4 even bites, drinking a swallow of water from the thermos after each one to make it last. The floor offered no comfort. She tried the built-in bench first, but when she opened the lid, a mouse leapt from inside and vanished under the stove with an offended rustle. The bench smelled of nesting and damp cloth. She closed it gently. Not because the mouse deserved gentleness, but because hard movements seemed wrong in a place this brittle. She chose the floor near the inner wall, away from the roof valley, just as the clerk had said. From the cardboard box, she took the dish towel that had wrapped the photograph and folded it beneath her head. The trash bag became a ground layer. Her coat became a blanket only after she tucked her arms inside the flannel and pressed her hands beneath her armpits. Evening came early in the cabin. Not as darkness does in towns, with porch lights and passing headlights delaying it, but completely from the corners inward. The hearth turned black. The window changed from grey to blue to a dull reflection of the room itself. The creak outside made a sound like glass being carefully broken under cloth. Once something moved in the wall above the bench, a small dry scurry that paused when she lifted her head and resumed when she lay still. The cold settled plank by plank. Sadie listened. She could hear the building more clearly from the floor. Wind entered under the door with a whistle that rose when gusts came down the creek bed. Somewhere near the chimney, a drop of melting snow fell at long intervals into a metal pan she had not yet seen. The roof clicked as it released the day's thin warmth. The stove made little contracting sounds, though no fire had touched it in years. Her breath warmed the dish towel, then cooled. She turned onto her side and faced the hearth. There was soot on the stones, not random soot, but the kind left by repeated use, season after season, fire after fire. Someone had sat here through winters before hers. Someone had hung socks from the iron hook. Someone had known which floorboard complained and which drawer stuck. Someone had tied careful wings beneath the back window while the creek spoke through spring runoff and September low water. For the first time in many weeks, no one could tell her to leave before morning. The thought did not comfort her loudly. It merely entered and sat down. Near midnight the wind shifted, and the door moved once against the nail. Sadie opened her eyes. Snow had begun again, soft enough that she could hear it only when it touched the cardboard over the broken pane. The sound was faint, steady, almost patient. She lay in the dark with her hand around the cold brass key inside her coat pocket. Not because a key could warm her, but because it proved the door had opened under her hand. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Morning did not arrive all at once. It gathered first as a grey loosening around the broken pane, then as a pale seam beneath the door, then as a faint silvering over the hearthstones where soot and old mortar had slept undisturbed through the night. Sadie woke with one cheek against the folded dish towel and one arm numb from being pinned under her ribs. For several seconds, she did not move. The body, when it has spent too many nights ready to flee, does not trust a roof merely because it remains overhead. She listened before opening her eyes fully. No knocking. No engine outside. No landlord's keys. No man clearing his throat in a hallway to announce that patience had ended. Only the creak. Only wind. The cabin was colder than the truck had been some mornings, because the cold had room to stand up inside it. Her boots had gone stiff at the toes. The water in the thermos had not frozen, but it had turned so frigid that drinking it made her teeth ache. She sat slowly, pressing her hands between her knees until feeling returned, and looked around the front room with the plain eye of daylight. The work appeared larger by morning. At night, the cabin had been a shelter. In daylight, it was a list. Broken pane, warped bench, hearth blocked, stove unstable, roof seams open, floor damp near the threshold, mouse sign along the wall, old leaves packed into the corner by the door. A smell under everything that said water had been entering longer than any person should have allowed. The place did not ask whether she was ready, it simply showed what had to be done. On the first day, she looked for water. The creek behind the cabin ran shallow and clear under shelves of ice, its bed dark with stones, its edges furred with frozen grass. She knelt carefully at a place where deer had broken the bank and filled the tin cup after cracking through a skin of ice with a fallen branch. The water was so cold it seemed heavier than ordinary water, as if each swallow had been cut from the mountain and not yet softened by air. Near the back wall, half hidden by willow and snow-crushed weed stems, she found the well. It was not much to see, a low circle of stones capped with 2 weathered planks and a rusted iron handle, bolted to a short post. The planks were iced in place. She cleared them by hand, then with the broken branch, then with the edge of the tin plate from the shelf. Beneath lay darkness and the mineral smell of earth. No bucket hung below, no rope. Only a pulley with a cracked wooden wheel and a hook so rusted it looked fused to the air. She dropped a pebble. It fell long enough that she held her breath. Then came a small, deep sound. Water. Not usable yet. Not trusted, but present. The outhouse stood farther back, beyond the walnut trees and a tangle of dead raspberry canes. One side had sunk, and the door hung crooked from leather hinges stiff as bark. Inside, light entered through a crescent moon cut into the plank door, and through gaps where boards had pulled apart. There was a hornet nest under the roof, deserted for winter, and a stack of yellowed Sears catalogue pages in a coffee can that had rusted through at the bottom. Sadie stood in the doorway and closed it again. Some discoveries did not require lingering. Those first 3 days were not heroic. They were cold, narrow, and exact. She learned the cabin by footfall. The threshold plank gave a hollow clack. The third board from the hearth side but held. The board near the bench in the front room dipped too far under weight, so she marked it with a strip of torn cardboard and stepped around it. In the back workroom, the floor was firmer, protected by the roof pitch, and the way the wind drove snow mostly toward the front. The back window rattled when gusts came down the creek, but its sash was sound. She swept with a cedar branch the first day, then found a broom handle without a broom in the lean-to and tied pine twigs to it, with thread pulled from the hem of the flannel nightgown. It made a poor broom, but it moved leaves and droppings into piles. She carried the piles outside on the tin plate and left them beneath the willows, where birds came later and inspected them with brisk ownership. She found no food left by former owners. No hidden pantry. No miracle in a cupboard. There was a jar of buttons, a tin of bent nails, 2 cracked mugs, a rusted coffee pot, and a mouse-gnawed sack that had once held flour and now held only the memory of it. Her meals came from what she could carry from town after walking in and back, day-old rolls given without comment by the cafe. 1 can of beans bought with coins Mrs. Baines had quietly returned as overpayment of recording fee, and coffee poured into her thermos by a waitress who said the pot was going stale anyway. On the 3rd afternoon, she went to the hardware store because staying warm without fire had become less possible with every hour. The store sat near the feed and seed, a deep, narrow building with a bell above the door and windows crowded by snow shovels, stove polish, lamp chimneys, rolls of copper tubing, and a display of leatherwork gloves stiff as new bark. The sign over the entrance read Hollis Hardware a Supply in green paint, faded at the corners. Inside, the store smelled of metal, paraffin, sawdust, rope, and seed potatoes kept somewhere in the back. Wooden drawers lined one wall from floor to ceiling, each with a brass pull and a label written in black pencil. Cotter pins, stove bolts, sash weights, escutcheon plates, cabinet catches, brass screws. Snowmelt darkened the boards near the door. A black cat slept on a folded seed sack beside the register, opening one yellow eye when Sadie entered, and deciding she was not worth getting up for. The man behind the counter had shoulders like an old fence post, square once and now worn down by weather. His white beard had been trimmed short except for a longer patch under the chin. One ear was missing its upper edge, not recently, and his left hand held two fingers that did not straighten fully. He wore a canvas apron over a plaid shirt, and a pencil rested behind his ear, as if it had grown there. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon." He waited. Hardware men in small towns are often better at waiting than ministers. Sadie set her list on the counter. She had written it at the library, then rewritten it after looking again at the chimney and the stove. The list was both too long and not long enough. Stove cement. Chimney brush if rentable. Wire brush. Work gloves. Safety matches. One small hatchet if used. Nails. Maybe. Window plastic. Rope. Bucket if cheap. Mouse traps. Kerosene. If a lamp could be made safe. Flour sack towels. Anything that could help close a broken pane without glass. The man read the list without touching it. "You are the Vale cabin." Sadie stood still. "That is what folks are calling it," he added. "Property names outlast owners around here. I'm trying to make it safe enough to sleep in. That is not the same as safe." "No," she said. "It is not." He took the pencil from behind his ear and circled 3 items. Chimney first. Draft and firebox. Everything else waits if you freeze before fixing it. I do not have money for much. I did not ask if you had much. She looked down at her gloves. They were damp along the seams from carrying creek water. "I can pay slowly," she said. "If you allow it, or I can work." The man studied her then. Not the way Mrs. Baines had measured, but as someone might study a board before deciding whether it would plane true. Name, Sadie Whitcomb, Hollis Arlen. He tapped the list with the pencil. "I keep charge accounts for ranchers, widows, and fools who buy condemned buildings in winter. Sometimes those categories overlap. You sign the ledger. You pay when you can. You do not disappear." "I won't." Most people who say that mean to be honest at the time. I know. He seemed to accept the answer because it did not defend itself. From beneath the counter, Hollis pulled out a green cloth-bound book with water stains along the bottom edge. The title, stamped in flaking gold, Read, Home, Repair for Farm and Cabin, 1949 edition. He opened it to the chimney section and flattened the page with his palm. "This is not for sale," he said. "You bring it back dry." "Yes, sir." And do not trust every modern video that tells you a chimney can be cleaned from the bottom with a miracle bag and a prayer. You have an old flu. You inspect what you can see, brush what you can reach, and keep your first fire mean and small. He began pulling items from shelves. A 6-inch round wire chimney brush with a dented threaded end rented at $1 a day, 2 fiberglass rods 50 cents each per day, a hand wire brush used 75 cents, a tub of black furnace cement $1.69, a roll of heavy plastic for the window $1.20 by the yard, cut from a remnant because he said the edge was crooked, a packet of 16-penny common nails 38 cents, a packet of 8-penny finish nails, 22 cents. A coil of 1/4-inch cotton rope, 10 cents per foot. and he measured 12 feet but wrote down 10. He added a second-hand galvanized bucket for 90 cents, a box of kitchen matches for 19 cents, 2 mouse traps for a quarter, a small tin of lamp oil marked down because the label had peeled, and a pair of leather gloves with cracked palms. "Gloves are no charge," he said. "They are too ugly to sell. They are not too ugly to use. That is why they are yours." Sadie looked at the growing pile, then at the ledger he turned toward her. The page held columns for names, items, dates and amounts. Ranch names appeared in broad pencil, family names, a church account, a line for Mrs. Baines with canning lids and stove polish written beside it. Hollis dipped a pen in a little bottle of ink, then handed it to Sadie. Her name looked thin on the page. Under amount, he wrote 8.83 tons credit extended. She stared at the number longer than she meant to. "That is a great deal." "That is a little," Hollis said. "A great deal comes later." He wrapped the chimney brush in old newspaper and tied the rods together with twine. Before she left, he opened the green repair manual again and pointed to a diagram of a flue. "You see this smoke shelf here? Creosote likes ledges. Birds like openings. Rain likes mortar cracks. Fire likes foolishness. You give each one less invitation than it had yesterday." Sadie carried the supplies back through afternoon light, already weakening. The chimney cleaning took her 5 hours the first day and 3 the next, because she did it badly at first and then less badly. She began outside, clearing snow from the base of the chimney and studying the stones. The lower courses were fieldstone, rounded and grey, packed with mortar that had failed in several places. Higher up, handmade brick took over, each brick slightly different, some darker from firing, some chipped at the corners. The cap was cracked. No proper screen remained. A bird nest, old and flattened by weather, sat inside the top where she could reach it only by climbing. There was no ladder. She made one poor attempt with a fallen cottonwood limb and decided dying beneath the chimney would not improve the property record. Instead, she worked from below. She spread the torn trash bag and old newspaper across the hearth, then hung more plastic in front of the firebox with nails driven lightly into existing cracks. The manual said to seal the opening to control soot. The manual assumed a person had tape. She used damp cloth pressed along the edges and 2 bricks to hold the plastic down. The first push of the brush upward met resistance 3 feet above the firebox. She turned the rod slowly, then pushed again. Something cracked loose in the dark above her and fell in a hard shower against the plastic. Soot burst around the cloth edges and covered her hands, wrists and chin before she learned to keep her face turned aside. Creosote came down in flakes like black fish scales, shiny in the lantern light and sharp along the edges. Then came grey ash, twigs, bits of feather, a small bone and mortar sand that hissed across the newspaper. Each rod length gained another reach. She worked the brush up, down, turn, up, down, turn. The fiberglass rod bowed against the angle where the flue narrowed. Her shoulders burned, her hands cramped around the handle. Every 20 minutes she stopped to let the soot settle and to cough into the scarf she had tied over her mouth. The smell was bitter and tarry, old smoke made solid, years of fires clinging to brick long after the people who lit them had gone. By dusk, she had opened a path but not trusted it. The next morning she repeated the work, brush upward until resistance, twist, pull back, add rod, twist again. She used the hand wire brush on the firebox, scraping loose scale from the throat and smoke shelf where creosote had hardened in ridges. With the tin cup, she scooped debris into the bucket. 3 full buckets came from the chimney before the fall slowed to powder. She found a broken brick wedged near the back of the hearth and removed it carefully. Behind it was a fist-sized gap in old clay. She packed the gap with furnace cement using a scrap of shingle, pressing the black paste into the crack and smoothing it with a wet finger inside the ugly glove. The cement smelled chemical and harsh, but it held, around the stovepipe joint. She chipped away crumbling clay and pressed fresh cement into the seam, working slowly until no daylight showed. When she was done, she had soot in both ears and under every fingernail. She returned the brush to Hollis before closing. He looked at the soot on her face and said, "You found the flue." "I found most of it. Most is where a person starts." He gave her a paper bag with 3 potatoes in it. "These rolled behind the bin," he said. "The first fire was no larger than a bird's nest. She built it in the hearth rather than the stove, because the stove still wobbled and one foot had to be dealt with properly. She used dry willow twigs shaved with the borrowed hatchet, a strip of cardboard, and 3 pieces of split pine Hollis had let her take from his scrap pile. Before striking the match, she opened the door an inch to give the room air. She checked the plastic at the window, she checked the chimney seam, she listened as if the building might object. The match flared blue, then yellow. Flame took the cardboard quickly. The shavings more slowly. Smoke hesitated at the throat of the chimney, gathered in a low, grey roll, then lifted. Not cleanly at first, not confidently, but upward. Sadie crouched on her heels and watched until her eyes watered from attention more than smoke. The fire remained mean and small. That was Hollis's word, and she understood it. Not generous, not celebratory, a careful fire, almost stern. It warmed only the hearthstones at first, then the air immediately around them. Then, after an hour, the front of her knees and palms when she held them out. She fed it little pieces no thicker than her wrist. Each time she added wood, she waited to see whether smoke would choose the room or the flue. By evening, the cabin had changed. Not transformed, never that quickly, but altered in one honest way. There was a living centre now, a red bed of coals where cold had ruled without challenge. Sadie set the dented coffee pot near the fire with creek water she had boiled longer than seemed necessary, then cut the 3 potatoes into uneven chunks with her pocket knife and cooked them in the tin cup with salt from a paper packet saved from the cafe. She ate sitting on the floor, back against the hearthstones. The potatoes were underdone in the middle and overdone at the edges. Ash had found its way into the cup. The tin burned her fingers if she forgot the rag. She ate every piece slowly and drank the cloudy water afterward because it had become broth by effort, if not by richness. Heat moved into her coat. Her socks steamed faintly near the fire. The mouse under the stove remained unseen but made one cautious sound, then withdrew. Sadie slept that night without her boots on. On the 4th day, she began the inventory of the workroom. She did not start with the chest. She had made a rule without naming it. Everything visible first. Everything loose first. The room deserved order before secrets, and so did she. She opened each drawer from left to right, top to bottom, and laid the contents on the bench in rows. First drawer, 3 spools of silk thread. Vone olive. Vone fo all brittle at the exposed ends. 2 empty hook envelopes marked Mustad 94840, size 14. A brass bobbin with 1 ceramic insert cracked. Dust, mouse pellets. Vone dead beetle. Second drawer, feathers wrapped in newspaper from 1978, too moth-eaten for tying, but still carrying hints of barred brown and cream. A small card labelled hen neck. Gishinger. Paid. No price. Third drawer stuck. She worked it gently, lifting from beneath while pulling until the swollen wood released with a pop that sounded too loud in the narrow room. Inside were glass vials, each corked, each holding hook. Some were rusted, some bright, some so small she had to hold them under the window to see the eye. Size 18, size 20, size 22. Emmett would have approved of the restraint. On the wall pegs she found the shadows of missing tools, their outlines preserved by cleaner wood beneath. Scissors had hung there, hackle pliers, a whip finisher, a bodkin. Perhaps the very tools she had seen in the photograph had once rested in a similar order somewhere else, then been carried away by relatives who mistook inheritance for salvage. Under the bench she found a cracked enamel basin, 2 bundles of kindling, a split leather rod tube, and a cigar box filled with lead wire, copper tinsel and tarnished beads. Beside the basin lay a small ledger, its cover gnawed at one corner. The pages listed dates, river names, hatch notes, guide fees, weather, fish counts when anglers insisted on keeping count, and once in a margin a sentence that made Sadie stop. Mr. Halverston wanted more red in the fly. Trout disagreed. She smiled, but only a little. The back shelf held jars of dubbing, muskrat, beaver, rabbit, seal substitute, written with a question mark. She opened one and found the contents dry but not ruined. Another held nothing but dust and the faint smell of cedar. A wooden spool rack carried thread whose colours had softened into names she would not have known how to give. River weed, wet stone, late grass, pale wing, blood knot red. She sorted what could be saved from what could not. Useful. Sentimental. Fire starter. Unknown. She made piles on the bench and wrote each in the library pencil on scraps torn from the green notice margin. The careful act steadied her. It gave the day a spine. Only after the visible work was finished did she turn toward the maple chest in the corner. It had sat there through all her cleaning, half beneath its stiff oilcloth, gathering no more attention than a sleeping animal. Now, with the room swept and the bench ordered, the chest seemed less like furniture and more like a question asked in wood. Sadie lifted the oilcloth. The chest was not Emmett's, but it had been made by the same language of hand and purpose. Maple aged to a warm amber beneath grime, dovetailed corners dark with dust, brass hinges green at the edges, a carrying handle folded flat into the lid. The surface held scratches from travel, pale scars where hooks or knives had scored it, and one circular stain the size of a coffee mug. Near the latch, a small fish had been carved with 3 sure cuts, not decorative exactly, more like a maker's mark. The clasp opened after pressure from both thumbs. Inside lay rows of cream wool, moth-damaged in places, but still fitted into shallow trays. Most compartments were empty. A few held flies flattened by time, a royal coachman with red floss dulled to brick, 2 soft hackles, a row of caddis patterns with elk hair chewed short, 1 streamer whose silver tinsel had blackened. The upper tray lifted by 2 ribbon tabs, and beneath it she found more compartments, some filled with old leaders coiled in wax paper, a leader wallet, strike indicators made from cork, and a folded map too brittle to open without steam. She did not yet see the anomaly. It came when she tried to lift the empty chest from the floor. It was too heavy. Not merely solid, not damp, heavy in a concentrated way that did not match its size or contents. Sadie set it down and removed every visible item, laying them on the bench. She lifted again, still heavy. She tilted it forward and listened. Nothing slid. She tapped the side with her knuckle. The maple answered with a clean wooden note. She tapped the bottom. The sound changed near the back left corner. Duller. Shorter. She froze, then tapped again in a measured pattern. Front right. Hollow. Front left. Hollow. Back right. Hollow enough. Back left. Not hollow. She turned the chest carefully onto a folded cloth and studied the underside. There were no obvious screws. No nails newer than the rest. No seam visible at first. But patience is an eye. Along the inner bottom, beneath where the wool tray had rested, she found 4 cedar discs no wider than shirt buttons, fitted flush into the corners and darkened to match the wood, plugs, not knots. Each had a tiny crescent notch near its edge, nearly hidden by grime. She scraped one gently with the tip of a rusted hook. The disc shifted. Sadie stopped breathing for a moment, then made herself continue slowly. She used a hook point to lift the first cedar disc. Beneath it lay a slotted brass screw. The second disc covered another. The third came loose only after she warmed it between her fingers. The fourth split as she lifted it, half remaining in place until she teased it free with the library pencil point. 4 screws, hand-cut slots, all darkened but intact. She did not have a proper screwdriver. From the cigar box, she chose a flat piece of brass leader tin and bent it over once for thickness. It slipped twice and cut into her glove. She tried again, pressing down before turning. The first screw moved with a faint cry. The second resisted until she touched a drop of lamp oil to the slot and waited. The third came free cleanly. The fourth broke the edge of her makeshift tool but loosened enough to turn by fingernail. When the false bottom lifted, it did not spring open or reveal itself dramatically. It rose one stubborn fraction at a time, sealed by dust and age. Sadie worked around the edge with the library pencil, then with the back of the pocket knife, careful not to gouge the maple. At last the panel released with a small dry sigh. Underneath lay brown paper packages tied with cotton string. For a long time, she only looked. The hidden space was deeper than expected, running nearly the full length of the chest. Cedar lined the compartment, which explained the faint, clean scent that rose after the panel moved. The first package was long and narrow, the second flat, the third wrapped in oilcloth. The fourth was a small tin box sealed with blackened tape. Beneath them, folded against the bottom, was a hand-drawn map on thick paper. Sadie carried the packages to the bench and set them beneath the window. She opened the long one first because it looked least likely to break her. Inside was a set of fly-tying tools wrapped in chamois, scissors with fine bright points, hackle pliers, 2 bobbins, a bodkin with a bone handle, a half-hitch tool, a whip finisher, and a small brass hair stacker darkened where fingers had held it. The scissors still opened cleanly. The bodkin point shone after she wiped it on the cloth. None of it was ornate. All of it was exact. The flat package held materials. Not random feathers, not leftovers, but labelled envelopes and packets arranged with the care of a person sending instruction forward through time. Wood duck flank, Hungarian partridge, blue dun hackle, peacock herl, elk hock, muskrat dubbing, fine copper wire, red silk floss, Pearsall's gossamer, primrose. A note in pencil lay on top. Keep dry. Use sparingly. Waste teaches nothing. The oilcloth bundle contained ledgers. She did not read them fully then. She only opened the top cover and saw names, dates, parcels, water temperatures, spawning beds, legal descriptions and sketches of bends and creeks, drawn by a hand that knew how land folded. Some pages held fishing notes. Others looked like records of purchases, payments, and agreements. The ink varied over decades. The tin box remained. It was the smallest thing on the bench and somehow the most difficult to touch. Sadie sat on the stool that had survived beneath the workbench and rested both hands on her knees. Outside, the creek moved under ice. The cabin stood around her, cold despite the banked fire in the front room, but the workroom itself seemed to have narrowed into the space between her hand and the tin lid. She peeled the black tape away in strips. The lid came free with effort. Inside lay money. Coins, a medal, and one folded letter tied with blue thread. She did not open the letter. Not yet. The money had been bundled in bank straps and envelopes, some newer than others, most old enough that the paper felt soft and fibrous beneath her fingertips. There were 20s, 10s, 5s, a few $100 bills from older series, and a stack of ones flattened by long compression. She counted once and lost her place because her hands began shaking. She counted again, slower, making piles of 1,000 on the bench and using hooks from the glass vial as markers. The total came to $42,000.73. The cents were not an afterthought. They were coins wrapped in cloth, 2 Morgan silver dollars worn at Liberty's cheek, 4 Walking Liberty $half, 7 Mercury dimes, 3 Buffalo nickels with dates mostly smoothed by use, 6 wheat pennies, and 1 steel cent from 1943, dark as a small winter moon. There was also a single brass token from an old Bozeman mercantile, good for 5 cents in trade, though no store remained to honor it. Beneath the coins lay a military medal in a square case. The ribbon had faded, but the bronze still held its shape. On the back, engraved in small block letters, was a name she did not know and a year that made the room feel older around her. 1145. She set the medal down as if it were warm. Under the medal case was the folded map. Sadie opened it only after placing the money back in careful piles and weighing the corners with tools so nothing could slide. The paper was thick, hand-drawn in ink and coloured pencil, brittle along the folds but legible. It showed the Gallatin, then side creeks, springs, marshes, unnamed feeder streams, and narrow strips of land marked in a code of initials and dates. Some areas were circled, others shaded lightly. Besides several, written in a patient hand, were phrases that made no sense until she saw the ledger again. Spawning gravel. No grazing after May. Cottonwood bank intact. Cold seep. Keep fenced. Do not sell water. Not fishing holes. Not claims for profit. Protected places. Her breath left her slowly. The hidden compartment had not been a miser's hoard. It had been an unfinished instruction. Money enough to repair something, perhaps, records enough to prove something, tools enough to begin again. A map showing water someone had loved so practically that he had tried to keep it out of careless hands. Sadie placed both palms flat on the workbench. She did not cry. The room did not ask that of her. Instead, she began putting things in order because order was the only answer her hands knew. Money back into paper bands, coins into cloth, metal into its case, tools rewrapped, materials lifted away from damp, map folded along its old creases and laid beside the letter she had not yet opened. The letter waited. Its blue thread had darkened with age, but the knot was still neat. Her name was not on it. No name was, only 4 words written across the front in ink browned almost to sepia. For the one who stays. Sadie touched the edge of the paper, then withdrew her hand. Evening had come while she counted. She banked the fire, closed the tin box without sealing it, and carried the map, letter and medal to the front room. Then she changed her mind and returned them to the workbench, where the back window still held what remained of the day. Some things deserved mourning. Some words should not be asked to enter a person when the light was failing and the body had been hungry too long. She stepped outside instead. The air had gone colder, but without wind. Snow lay blue over the track and along the willow stems. The creek ran black where water showed between ice shelves, moving steadily, not hurried, not delayed by being witnessed. Above the trees the first stars had come out faintly over Gallatin Gateway. Somewhere far off, a dog barked twice and stopped. Sadie walked to the bank and stood there until the cold entered her boots. The water spoke in its low, patient language over stone and under ice. She watched it pass through land marked on the map, land someone had named, measured, paid for, and hidden away from greed with no audience to praise him. She thought of Emmett's hand's guiding thread. She thought of Hollis writing credit in a ledger. She thought of Mrs. Baines warning her about the roof valley and leaving the bills beneath a paperweight long enough to make kindness look official. Behind her, the cabin waited with its poor roof, its clean chimney, its hidden inheritance, and its unopened letter. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. By morning, frost had written itself along the inside of the back window in white fern shapes, so fine they seemed drawn with a single hair. The creek light came through them broken and pale, falling across the workbench in narrow pieces. Sadie had woken before the sun touched the roof, not because she had slept well, but because the folded letter had entered the room's silence and taken up more space than any object its size should hold. She made the morning ordinary before she allowed it to become otherwise. Ashes first. She lifted the stove lid with a rag, stirred the grey bed in the hearth, and found one coal alive near the back, a dull red eye under powder. She laid cedar shavings beside it, then 3 willow twigs, then 1 split piece of pine no thicker than 2 fingers. The fire took slowly. She boiled creek water in the dented pot, poured half into the tin cup, and held the cup with both hands until feeling came into the joints. Only then did she return to the workroom. The letter lay where she had left it, tied with blue thread on the maple plank. In daylight she could see the ink more clearly. Browned, yes, and feathered at the edges where the paper had absorbed winter and summer through decades of hiding, but still precise. The words on the front had been written by someone trained to save space and mean every stroke, for the one who stays. Sadie sat on the stool. She untied the thread and set it aside, straightening it once with her finger. The paper opened along old creases, not easily, not with resistance exactly, but with the slight reluctance of something folded around its own weather. When she saw the first line, her hand moved to the edge of the bench and held there. The handwriting resembled what had been penciled above the workroom window. Not identical, older, more formal, the letters upright and slender, the capitals made with a small restrained flourish, but the same patience lived in it, the same habit of leaving room between lines. Whoever had written the hatch notes had learned from this hand or taught it or belonged somewhere in the long quiet exchange between them. Sadie lowered her face toward the page and began. My dear one, whoever you are, If you have found this letter, then the chest has done its last good work, and kept its counsel longer than I could keep mine. I do not know your name, I do not know whether you are of my blood, of my affection, or only of the honest accident by which worthy hands come to neglected things. I know only that you opened the lower panel carefully enough not to break it, and that tells me something I'm willing to trust. I'm writing from St. Vincent Hospital in Billings, where Dr. Harold Meeks has told me plainly that the growth in my left lung is not a passing illness, and will not be cured by mountain air, cod liver oil, or the stubbornness for which my family has long been both blessed and punished. He has given me months if I am fortunate, and less if I am not. I have no wish to spend those months explaining to men in offices why water, feathers, and memory should not be sold to the highest bidder. So I write to you. My people began with Asa Vale, born 1819 in County Cork, who crossed the sea in 1847 with a satchel of awls, hooks, and his mother's falter. He married Elspeth Marr of Vermont in 1851 near St. Louis, and they followed wagon work west until the Missouri and the mountain rivers taught him trout, were as fussy about truth as any priest. Their son, Silas Vale, born 1856 at Fort Benton, guided surveyors, priests, hungry soldiers, and foolish sportsmen, and he learned to tie with horsehair leaders and whatever bird the season gave without waste. His daughter, Cora Vale, born 1881 near Salesville, Montana, was my mother, and she could split a mallard feather, dress a hook, and read cloud shadow on water before she was 15. I am Ruth Elspeth Vale, born 1902 in Gallatin County, last daughter of that line to keep the bench by right and duty. The trade did not end because trout stopped rising. It ended on June 17, 1959, when the river came high and hard after 2 days of warm rain on mountain snow. A party from Chicago had insisted on fishing above the safe mark. My brother Thomas went after them when they failed to return by dusk. He brought 2 men out and lost his footing on the 3rd crossing. They found his hat below the Cottonwood Bend and his body 3 days later near Spanish Creek. After the funeral, the guiding licenses expired, the hotel stopped sending names, and people began buying machine-made flies in plastic cups. My father shut the front door to customers on July 1st of that year and never hung the sign straight again. For more than 30 years afterward, we were silent in the way families become silent when one loss is asked to stand for all losses. My father would not speak of water. My mother tied only for herself. My husband, Daniel Keene, who had served in the Pacific in 1945 and came home with 1 medal and a cough that never left him, kept the ledgers because he believed land mattered even when men could not bear to say so. We lost Daniel to that same war after it had already ended, for some wounds keep walking inside a man long after the ship brings him home. We had 1 son, Matthew, who left for Korea in 1951 and returned with eyes older than my father's. He did not stay. I do not blame him. A house can hold memory too tightly for the young. Here is what must be known if the bench is ever used again. Keep your feathers dry but not brittle. If a packet has slept too long, set it near steam, never over it, and let the fibres remember their shape. Wax silk thread lightly. Too much wax makes the body dull and heavy. For a proper March brown, use a size 12 or 14 hook, a thread base even from eye to bend, tail of 3 fibres only, body of hare's ear mixed 2 parts grey to 1 part rusty brown, ribbed with fine gold or copper in 5 open turns. Hackle should be sparse. Trout distrust vanity. For low winter water, dress every fly 1 size smaller than your pride suggests. Keep varnish thin. Let each head dry 12 hours before it is boxed. Longer if the room is below 40 degrees. If you dye wool or dubbing, bring water only to a shy simmer, never a boil, and add vinegar by the spoon, not the cup. Colour forced too hot fades without honour. As for the maps, they are not treasure in the common sense. The parcels marked there were bought in pieces by my father, my mother, Daniel, and me, whenever a widow needed taxes paid, whenever a rancher wished to straighten a fence, whenever a spring seep was in danger of being trampled into mud. Some deeds are recorded cleanly, some are agreements that will require patience and a courthouse. We did not buy them to own the rivers. No one owns moving water. We bought what banks we could so that the gravel beds might remain unspoiled, and so that 1 cold thread of the country might pass through greed without being turned into a ditch. The money is for roof, Fire, glass, paper, and time. Spend it as if every dollar had already worked once before it reached your hand. Do not turn it into display. Do not let anyone flatter you into speed. A careful inheritance does not announce itself. It repairs, pays taxes, sharpens tools, replaces rotten sills, and keeps one chair by the fire for the next person who arrives cold. I have lived long enough to know that blood is a narrow bridge and kindness is a wider one. If you are kin, then take this as my hand across the years. If you are not kin, then perhaps you are still the answer to a prayer I was too tired to word properly. Either way, the house is not yours because paper says so. It becomes yours only if you learn its leaks, its drafts, its stubborn boards, and its uses. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Ruth Elspeth Vale Keene, October 9th, 1991. Sadie reached the signature and did not turn the page, because there was no page left to turn. She sat with the letter open before her, while the fire in the front room settled and clicked. The wind moved over the roof with a dry hand. A bead of thawed frost slid down the inside of the window and paused on the sash, holding the morning light in a trembling oval. She read the letter again. The second reading took longer, not because the words were hard, but because the room had changed around them. The bench beneath her hands was no longer only a bench. The marks in its surface had become work, refusal, argument, grief, weather, instruction. The hidden chest was no longer only a hiding place. It was an old woman's last act of order, a way of placing useful things where hurry would not find them. When she finished, Sadie folded the paper along its original creases. She did not smooth it flat. She did not make it newer than it was. She brought one crease to another, corner to corner, with the care of matching wings on a dry fly, and tied the blue thread around it again without tightening the knot too much. Then she set it beside the tools and placed both palms on the bench, fingers spread, until the grain of the maple imprinted itself faintly into her skin. There was a marker mentioned between the lines, if not in the way maps use marks. The cottonwood bend, the walnut trees, the parcels, the house becoming yours only by learning its uses, and in one ledger, found beneath the oilcloth bundle and opened only after the letter, there was a small sketch in the margin beside an entry from 1938. It showed the back door, the path toward the creek, and a horseshoe nailed in the fork of a walnut tree with an arrow beneath it. She took the ledger outside. The cold had brightened. Snow under the walnut trees held a crust that broke under each step. Behind the cabin, two trunks rose close enough to share one shadow, their bark dark and ridged, their bare limbs crossing like old hands at rest. She walked around the first and found nothing. Around the second, she had to push aside dead raspberry canes and a curtain of willow stems before the shape appeared. A horseshoe, black with age, had been nailed into the inside fork of the tree. The bark had grown around the ends until iron seemed less attached to the walnut than remembered by it. One nail remained visible, the other had disappeared into living wood. Beneath the shoe, cut into the bark with a knife and nearly healed over, was a small mark like a tied fly seen from above. Wings, body, hook curve. Sadie touched the iron with 2 fingers. It was colder than stone. Beyond the walnut, the creek moved through its winter channel. She could see now how the land folded. The cabin sat not randomly, but in a watching place between road and water, high enough to escape ordinary flood, low enough to hear every changing current. The workroom window faced east-southeast, catching morning light without taking the worst western wind. The roof valley failed because snow gathered there. The well stood where a seep likely fed it from higher ground. The path from door to creek had been used so long that even weeds respected it. Learning, she understood, would not be sentimental. It would require crowbars and patience, permits, receipts, cold hands, honest estimates, the humility of asking people who knew more, the restraint not to spend money merely because it was present, the willingness to repair what no one else had thought profitable enough to keep. She returned inside and took from the chest one of the old candles she had overlooked the night before. It had been wrapped with the materials, not among the money, a narrow beeswax taper gone deep gold with age, tied in paper on which someone had written, Christmas, 1961. The wick had bent but not broken. 60 years, perhaps more, waiting in a hidden compartment where mice had not reached it and damp had not softened it. Sadie found an iron candlestick on the upper shelf of the front room, black with soot but steady after she wiped the base. She set it on the workbench rather than the hearth. The candle took flame from a splinter lit at the fire, its wick sputtering once before settling into a modest blue-scented light. The smell rose almost immediately. Beeswax, faint honey, old paper, a warmth gentler than pine smoke. The flame threw the tools into small shadows. The brass hair stacker gleamed. The bone-handled bodkin looked pale as a finger bone. The letter, folded and tied, rested beside the candle in a pool of amber. Sadie stood before it with her hands at her sides. There are lights that make a room brighter, and lights that make it more truthful. This was the second kind. It did not erase the cracked window or the dirt in the floor seams. It did not mend the roof. It showed everything plainly and made plainness bearable. After a while, she carried the candle to the front room and set it on the hearthstone while she warmed her hands. Kindness came back to her then, not as comfort but as a chain of plain acts, each one too small to save a life alone and too necessary to dismiss. Mrs. Baines keeping the first payment under the trout paperweight long enough to return coins without naming charity. Hollis opening a ledger and making debt feel less like accusation than trust. The waitress with tired red wrists pouring coffee that had gone stale anyway. The bus driver warning her about the temperature instead of pretending the walk was shorter than it was. Even Nolan's damage could not own the whole road behind her. There had been others, a bakery sack tied twice behind the back door, a librarian who looked at her damp coat and said there were study rooms open if she needed quiet, a man at the car wash in Belgrade who put quarters into the air pump after seeing her kneel beside the soft tire, then walked away before thanks could require anything from him. If you're watching this from a warm room tonight, maybe you know one small kindness that stayed with you long after the person who gave it had gone on with their day. Maybe it was a sandwich, a ride, a porch light left on, a debt forgiven, a blanket, a sentence said at the exact hour when silence might have broken you. Tell us about it in the comments if you can. Some stories survive because ordinary people keep passing small mercy from hand to hand. Sadie let the candle burn only 20 minutes. The old taper had waited too long to be used carelessly. She pinched the wick with damp fingers, and the flame folded into a thread of smoke that rose straight upward before the draught found it. Then she returned the candle to the workbench, not hidden now, only set in the candlestick beside the letter. That night, she did not put the heirlooms back into the secret compartment. She wrapped the tools in their chamois and laid them inside the cardboard box near her shoulder. The map went beneath the folded dish towel where it would stay flat and dry. The letter she placed under Emmett's photograph, not because one was more important than the other, but because the two belonged in conversation. The medal in its square case rested beside the hearth, close enough to the fire to catch a little light, far enough away to remain untouched by ash. She lay down on the floor away from the roof valley. As before. The cabin was still cold, the walls still breathed wind. Mice still owned parts of the night she had not yet earned the right to claim, but around her the objects kept their quiet stations: tools, map, letter, medal, candle, photograph, not riches. Not rescue in the way stories sometimes hurry toward, more like witnesses. Snow began after midnight, soft and deliberate. Sadie listened until sleep came. One hand resting on the box where the chamois-wrapped tools lay, the other tucked beneath her cheek. In the room behind her, the bench waited under the window, and on it the folded letter held its shape in the dark. On December 6th, the first real snow came down without wind, 8 inches by noon and nearly 10 by the time daylight withdrew behind the hills. It covered the track, softened the broken hasp, filled the seams between the roof shakes, and made the cabin look from a distance more whole than it had any right to look. Sadie watched from the front room while the fire worked at its little bed of coals, and she understood that snow could be merciful to the eye while being merciless to a roof. By mid-afternoon, the drip began. Not the occasional meltwater she had heard before, but a steady cold ticking into the metal pan near the chimney, and a darker, more troubling stain spreading along the plank ceiling where the roof valley met the original wall. She climbed onto the bench with a candle and found the seam above it wet enough to shine. When she touched the board, water entered the grain and ran along her finger. The roof could not wait for a better season. That night she opened Hollis's green repair manual to the chapter on roof patching and read it 3 times. Though much of it had been written for barns, not condemned guide cabins with cedar shakes laid by men long dead, she read beside the fire until the words began to repeat themselves in her mind. Establish sound substrate, remove failed material, overlap felt, maintain drainage plane, never trap water where it wishes to leave. She drew the roof on a sheet torn from the back of the ledger copy she had made at the library, 22 feet by 14 for the original section. Lean to back room pitched shallower, perhaps 10 by 14. The worst failure was not everywhere, that mattered. A full roof would take money, labour, dry weather, and time she did not have in December. A careful repair could buy winter. She measured with string when the snow stopped. From the ground, from the doorway, from a branch laid across the eaves, from the inside stain, she marked the valley line with charcoal on paper and calculated what she would need. 1 roll of 30-pound roofing felt, because the roof pitch and winter exposure needed more than the thin paper used on sheds. 3 bundles of cedar shingles would have been proper but too dear, so Hollis suggested 1 bundle for exposed patches and a sheet of galvanized tin to cover the valley temporarily, 2 pounds of 1 1/4 inch galvanized roofing nails, 1 pound of 2-inch ring shank nails for fastening battens, a tube of roof sealant he disliked but admitted had its uses if applied dry, and 2 8-foot spruce boards to sister 1 rafter beneath the sag. The list came to more than she wished to see. Hollis read it over his counter and made a sound low in his throat. "You're trying to fix spring with December hands," he said. "I'm trying to keep the ceiling from coming down before spring. That is a narrower ambition. Better." He walked into the back room of the hardware store and returned with a roofing hatchet whose wooden handle had gone dark from use. The head was scarred, the gauge still adjustable, the blade nicked but serviceable. On one side, faintly stamped, were the initials R.A. "My uncle used this until his knees went bad," Hollis said. He could lay a roof so straight a crow would walk the ridge to admire it. "He is beyond needing it. I can rent it. You can return it sharp." Sadie took the hatchet with both hands. Before she left, Hollis leaned on the counter and looked past her through the store window. Where snow had begun to crust along the sill, there is a man who walks by your place most mornings if the road allows it. Abel Roan. Used to roof every barn between here and Manhattan. Does not take work now. Might take offence if you call it work. I cannot pay him. I did not say you could. Abel arrived 2 days later, just after sunup, carrying a ladder on one shoulder as if he had only borrowed it from gravity. He was 70, maybe more, lean as a shovel handle, with a face narrowed by wind and eyes, the pale blue of skim ice. His coat had been mended at both elbows with canvas patches. A wool cap sat low over his ears. He did not knock. He leaned the ladder against the eave, stepped back to look at the roof and said, "Too steep to ignore, too rotten to trust." Sadie stood in the doorway with soot on one cuff and a hammer in her hand. "Mr. Roan. Abel. Hollis mentioned you. Hollis talks to keep from rusting." She waited. Abel looked at the chimney, the valley, the sag near the front wall, and the patch of tin that had been nailed badly some time before. Then he pointed with 2 fingers. "You go up first." Sadie looked at the ladder. "I have not done a roof before. I guessed that from the way you are holding that hammer, for 11 days, whenever weather allowed and sometimes when it did not, Abel Roan came to the cabin and taught in short sentences. He would not take money. He would not take coffee unless it was already poured. He accepted one boiled potato at noon on the third day, ate it standing, and handed the empty tin cup back without comment. His teaching style had no decoration. "That nail's proud." Sadie looked at the nail head raised slightly above the shingle. "Pull it." She pulled it. Again. She drove another. Too hard. She pulled it. Again. By the fourth day, she understood that roofing was not one action repeated, but 100 judgments made before each strike, where the wood was sound, where it had softened, which shake could stay, which one had failed beneath a surface that still looked honest. How felt should overlap, so water always met the back of the next layer, never the lip of a hidden seam. How a chalk line was less a mark than a promise. How a hatchet gauge kept courses from wandering when cold fingers no longer trusted the eye. The sister rafter went in first. Inside the cabin, beneath the sagging roof valley, Abel made her brace the ceiling with a temporary post cut from a spruce pole. Outside, they cleared snow from the failed section with a broom, not a shovel, because a shovel would catch and split what still held. They lifted the worst shakes, pried out nails, and exposed a rafter darkened by water along its upper edge. It was not gone, but it had surrendered enough strength to need company. The new board slid beside it after much persuading. Sadie held it in place while Abel drilled pilot holes by hand, the bits squeaking through cold wood. They fastened the sister with 3-inch structural screws Hollis had sold at cost, and 2 carriage bolts. Abel produced from his coat pocket without explanation. The old rafter remained. The new one did not erase it. It stood beside it and took weight. "There," Abel said. Not pretty. Honest. The valley came next. They laid roofing felt in a wide strip under the tin, overlapping the edges beneath the surrounding shakes. Abel showed her how to tuck without tearing, how to leave a slight channel for water, how to avoid sealing the lower edge where trapped melt could rot the roof from beneath. The galvanized tin was not beautiful. It shone too brightly against the dark cedar until weather would humble it. Sadie did not mind. A repair did not have to pretend to be original to be respectful. Her hands learned the 3-stroke nail. Set. Drive. Seat. Not set. Pound. Bury. Not timid tapping until the nail bent from insult. 3 strikes when the arm knew its measure. Abel watched until she could do it 5 times in a row without making him breathe through his nose in disapproval. "Good enough," he said. From him, that was close to a sermon. On December 17th, after a morning of thin sun and air cold enough to make each nail sting through the glove, they finished the last exposed row beneath the ridge. Sadie swept loose splinters from the roof with the broom and stood halfway down the ladder to look. The repaired section did not make the cabin whole, it made it less doomed. The valley was covered. The sag was arrested, the front seam no longer showed daylight from inside. Abel took his ladder down and rested it on his shoulder. "I will bring it again when spring shows what we missed," he said. "Thank you." He nodded once toward the roof. "Thank the pitch. It still wants to shed water." Then he walked back down the track, leaving his footprints in a narrow, deliberate line through the snow. That night, when the temperature fell and the roof clicked above her, no water entered the pan by the chimney. Sadie lay awake long enough to hear the difference. Silence can be a repair. January began with blue cold and a chimney that had agreed to draw but not yet agreed to last. Sadie had known from the first cleaning that the flue was only provisionally safe. Fire, like trust, must not be enlarged merely because it answers once. After the roof patch, she turned her attention to the chimney from the ground upward, reading the repair manual, the margin notes in Ruth's ledgers, and a masonry pamphlet Hollis found folded inside a box of old trowels. The work did not flatter the inexperienced. It used words that carried weight: spalling, repointing firebox throat, lime expansion, draft, cure. The damage showed plainly after a thaw on January 5th. Several bricks near the top courses had faces flaking away in thin red scales. The mortar between the handmade bricks had powdered so badly that Sadie could scrape it out with a nail. At the lower fieldstone base, gaps had opened where water entered, froze, and expanded season after season, prying patience apart grain by grain. The chimney still stood because it had been built by someone careful. It would not stand forever on memory. Hollis would not sell her modern Portland cement for the repair. Too hard, he said, setting the bag aside before she could lift it. You trap old brick against mortar stronger than its bones. The brick loses. He measured from bins and sacks in the back, explaining as he worked for the exterior repointing below the roofline, a hydraulic lime mortar, 2.5 parts sharp sand to 1 part natural hydraulic lime. For the firebox and throat, a hotter mix, 3 parts sharp sand, 1 part fireclay, 1 part lime, with just enough water to hold a pressed ridge, not soup, not cake batter. A mortar that sat on the trowel like it had made a decision. He sold her a pointing trowel with a worn tip for 40 cents, a joint raker for $1, a stiff brush, a bucket of clean sand, a small bag of fireclay, and a half bag of lime he had taped shut. Gloves, he said. I have them. Gloves that do not have holes. She looked at the cracked pair on her hands. He added another pair to the ledger and did not write a price beside them. For 3 weeks she worked in temperatures mostly in the 20s, sometimes lower before noon, always aware that mortar disliked freezing as much as fingers did. She built small fires only after clearing loose material from the firebox, and never while fresh repair sat too close. She warmed water near the hearth and mixed mortar in batches no larger than she could use before it stiffened. On the coldest mornings she heated the bricks gently with a pan of coals set nearby, not enough to make them hot, only enough that they would not steal the cure too quickly. The work was slow by design. Rake out failed mortar to a depth twice the joint width. Brush dust. Mist lightly. Never soak. Press mortar firmly from the back of the joint forward. Strike when thumbprint firm. Protect from hard freeze with burlap and old cloth. Return the next day and do not admire too soon. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes, even inside gloves, because the work required touch and the tools transmitted cold through metal and wet mortar. She would press fresh mix into a joint, strike it, brush the edges, then stop and tuck her fingers beneath her arms until pain returned. Sometimes she walked in circles around the hearth to make blood move. Sometimes she stood at the front window and watched steam leave her sleeves. The chimney taught proportion. Too much water, and the mortar slumped from the joint too dry, and it crumbled under the trowel. Too much pressure, and the face smeared across the brick. Too little, and a hidden hollow remained where water would enter later and undo the mourning. She learned to listen to the scrape of trowel against masonry. She learned the smell of lime, chalky and clean, and the different smell of fireclay, earthy and faintly metallic. One afternoon, Hollis came by carrying a canvas sack of scrap hardwood. He stood in the front room without removing his cap and inspected the lower firebox with the gravity of a doctor listening to lungs. He ran one stiff finger near a new joint and nodded. Not fast, he said. No, good. Fast masonry fails with confidence. He left the hardwood beside the door and took away nothing but the empty lamp oil tin she had meant to return. By late January, the chimney looked no grander to anyone passing outside. That pleased her. The best repairs did not wave. They restored purpose to its proper place and became background again. The spalled bricks remained scarred. The mortar lines were not perfectly uniform, but the open gaps had closed, the firebox throat had been sealed, and the stove thimble no longer leaked smoke when the wind came from the west. The test fire took place on January 28th. After 3 dry days and 1 pale morning of sun. Sadie built it smaller than desire wanted, shavings first, then twigs, then 2 pieces of hardwood the length of her hand. She warmed the flue with a twist of newspaper held near the throat, watching the smoke pull upward instead of rolling back. Then she lit the fire and sat on her heels, eyes level with the hearth, waiting for any sign of failure. Smoke rose clean. Not perfectly at first, because no old chimney owes perfection, but steadily, without spilling into the room, without searching the cracks, without staining the new joints. The draught deepened as warmth climbed, the flame brightened, the fire made the modest inward sound of wood agreeing to become heat. Sadie stayed beside it for an hour, feeding only one small piece at a time. When she finally stood, her knees ached, and lime dust had dried in white half-moons around her cuffs. She carried the bucket outside, emptied the last rubble of old mortar beneath the willow bank, and looked back at the chimney against the winter sky. It was still leaning slightly. It was still aged and imperfect and would need more work when spring allowed a ladder and longer daylight. But it no longer seemed abandoned by function. It had taken smoke and given it a path. It had become, in its restrained way, useful again. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. The floors could have waited, but waiting had limits of its own. By late January, after the chimney drew and the roof valley stopped dripping, Sadie began to notice how the cabin held dirt differently from neglect. Neglect was everywhere at first, loud and obvious. Leaves, droppings, soot, broken glass, fallen mortar. Dirt remained after neglect retreated. It lived in seams. It darkened traffic paths. It held the fine grey dust of decades and the damp memory of boots, snowmelt, ash and mice. The pine planks in the front room were worth saving. Hollis told her that before she fully believed it. He came one morning to deliver stove bolts and found her kneeling beside the threshold, pressing a knife point into a dark board near the door. "Do not condemn pine for looking tired," he said. "It is cupped. So are most hands by 70. It has rot near the sill. Some, not all." He crouched with difficulty and showed her how to judge. The knife entered too easily at the first 6 inches of 2 boards by the threshold. Those would need patches later, farther in. The wood was sound under the discoloration. Wide white pine plank, hand-planned face-nailed with rose-head nails that had blackened into the grain. The nail heads were not machine-perfect. Each one had a tiny irregular crown, hammered by hand long before Sadie knelt there with soot on her sleeve and a borrowed awl. "Do not sand the nails proud," Hollis warned. "Set what needs setting. Leave what tells the truth." She rented the Random Orbit sander from the hardware store for $14 a day, a machine heavy enough that carrying it back down the track took both arms and 3 rests. Hollis sent a paper sack of sanding discs with it, each labelled in pencil, 80, 120, 2 centi. He told her to let the tool do its work and not bear down like she was punishing the floor. The first pass was with 80 grit. Before she began, she set every raised nail she could find with a nail set and hammer, tapping carefully so the rose heads sat just beneath the surface without disappearing. She swept twice. She opened the door for dust, though the cold entered at once. She tied a scarf over her mouth, knelt, and started the sander. The machine startled the cabin. Its hum filled the front room, coarse and insistent, vibrating up through Sadie's wrists and shoulders. At first, the old finish came away unevenly, revealing pale streaks beneath the grime. Then, broader colour emerged. Not new wood, not clean in the cheap sense. Pine that had lived under use and darkness, still marked, still scarred, but willing to show grain. She moved slowly with the boards, never across, never in impatient arcs, one plank at a time, overlapping passes, pausing often to vacuum dust into the borrowed shop vac Hollis had sent, with a frayed cord and a warning not to trip the breaker she did not yet have. Since there was no power, she ran the sander from an extension line. Hollis brought off a small generator Abel loaned for 2 afternoons, the generator coughing outside like an elderly mule under protest. The 80 grit removed the worst. The 120 softened the harshness left behind. The 220 made the surface quiet under the hand. After each pass she swept, wiped with a barely damp cloth, and waited for dust to settle out of the air. Fine pine powder coated her hairline, her eyelashes, the folds at her elbows. It lay on the hearthstones and on the cardboard she had taped over the window. It turned the black cat from Hollis's store grey when it appeared unexpectedly in the doorway on the second day and inspected the room before leaving without permission or apology. The back workroom floor received a lighter hand. Those planks held tool marks and old scars she refused to erase. Beneath the tying bench, the floor had been worn smooth where feet had rested through years of work. Under the stool, 2 heel marks darkened the pine. Sadie sanded around them and left them visible. Some signs were not damage. Some were companionship across time. For finish, Hollis argued with himself in the store aisle. Pure tung oil cures slower, but water resists better. Boiled linseed is cheaper and easier, but rags can burn a place down if you wad them up like a fool. A blend will do if you respect it. They settled on a mix he trusted for cabin floors, 2 parts tung oil, Vone part boiled linseed oil, thinned slightly with citrus solvent for the first coat so it would enter the grain. He wrote down the ratios on a paper bag and underlined, lay rags flat outside to dry. Do not pile. Do not sleep beside oily cloth. The first coat darkened the floor almost beyond recognition. Sadie applied it with a lint-free rag, working along the boards from the far wall toward the door. The pine drank unevenly. Pale places turned honey, darker paths deepened toward amber. Around the hearth, where heat and smoke had entered the grain for decades, the colour went nearly mahogany, rich and solemn, as if firelight had been stored there and only needed oil to speak again. She waited 48 hours. The second coat went thinner, the third thinner still, buffed by hand until the floor no longer felt thirsty. Between coats she walked only in socks and kept the fire small enough not to blow ash across the finish. She ate standing by the door or sitting on the unworked bench with her feet tucked beneath her. Every movement became deliberate because one careless step could mark what patience had just restored. There was one bad morning. It came after the second coat, when the floor shone dully in the dawn and the roof held, and the chimney drew, and everything should have made a person grateful enough to continue. Sadie woke with her limbs heavy and her hands swollen from sanding. Her knuckles were cracked. Her lower back seized when she bent to lift the water bucket. The thought of mixing oil, wiping boards, counting hours, carrying wood, and calculating debt at Hollis's ledger arrived like weather too large for the doorway. She did not work that day. She put on her coat and walked beyond the outhouse, past the walnut trees, toward a low marshy stretch where the creek widened before gathering itself again. Snow lay unevenly there, broken by reed stems and the dark punctures of animal tracks. She found a flat stone near the water and sat with her hands inside her sleeves. A great blue heron stood on the far bank. It should have been south, she thought, or somewhere warmer, but there it was, slate-coloured and still as a carved thing, one long leg hidden beneath its body, the other planted in the icy shallows. It did not hunt while she watched. It only stood, patient and improbable, with snow behind it and water moving around its narrow ankles. Sadie sat there until the cold climbed through the stone. She did not name the weight in her chest. She did not argue with it. She watched the heron lift at last, slow wings opening wider than seemed possible for such a folded creature. It crossed the creek without hurry and disappeared beyond the willows. The next morning, she finished the third coat. February entered through the windows because the windows had never learned to keep it out. There were 8 in all if she counted the small square sash in the lean-to. 3 had no glass, 4 were cracked, some with single clean lines, others with branching fractures that caught frost in white veins. 1. The east window above the tying bench remained original, with wavy glass so uneven that the creek beyond it seemed to move even when she stood still. Hollis told her the glass might be from far earlier than the cabin's last guide years, perhaps salvaged from an older structure. Abel, who looked at it once and squinted, said only, "Do not replace that." So she did not. Glass was dear. Heat was dearer. She made priorities with pencil and cold fingers. The missing panes first, then the cracks in the front room, then the lean-to. The original east window would be cleaned, stabilized, and protected, but not made falsely new. Hollis ordered 3 pieces cut to size from Bozeman, and for the smaller gaps he found salvaged panes in the loft above the hardware store, each wrapped in newspaper from years that no longer felt recent. He sold her glazing points by the handful and DAP 33 glazing putty from a can whose lid required a screwdriver and patience. The putty smelled faintly oily and mineral, like a school art room remembered through dust. "Warm it in your hands," Hollis said. Cold putty fights. Everything fought in February. The first sash came free only after Sadie worked paint from the edges with a putty knife and tapped the joints loose with a wooden block. She laid it flat on the bench, removed old glazing in hard grey chips, and pulled rusted points with needle-nose pliers. The rabbits were dry and rough. She brushed them clean, primed bare wood, where Hollis told her to, and let it tack near the fire without putting it close enough to warp. The technique was simple until the hand attempted it. Roll the putty into a rope, press a thin bedding layer into the rabbit, set the glass gently, never forcing corners, push glazing points into wood with the putty knife, 2 per side on the small panes, more for larger ones, then press fresh putty along the edge and draw the knife in one smooth angled pass, leaving a bevel that shed water and showed a clean line from inside. The knife must be held low enough to smooth and high enough not to scrape the glass. Too much, putty looked clumsy, too little failed. Sadie made poor work of the first pane. The bevel wandered, the corner lumped, her knife lifted and left a torn place she had to patch. She scraped it off and began again. By the 3rd attempt, the line held. By the 2nd window, she could make a corner without muttering under her breath. By the 4th, she understood why old glaziers had hands that seemed both heavy and precise. The sash cords were worse. 2 front windows still held their counterweights hidden inside the frames, but the cotton cords had rotted and snapped, leaving the sashes either painted shut or ready to fall. Hollis sold her 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, not nylon because old pulleys liked what they knew. Abel lent a narrow pry bar and showed her where the pocket covers hid under paint. "Do not split the trim," he said. "I am trying not to. Trying is loud. Go slower." She went slower. Behind the little covers, the iron counterweights hung like dark bones in the wall pockets. She tied the new cord with a figure-8 knot at each weight, testing it twice before feeding it over the pulley. The cord ran with a soft rasp. She attached the other end to the sash groove, set the window back and lifted. For the first time in perhaps years, the lower sash rose and stayed open on its own. Cold air entered freely through the opening. Sadie laughed once, very quietly, then shut it. By the 2nd week of February, 7, windows had been repaired enough to keep out weather with dignity, not perfectly. Some cracks were stabilized rather than replaced. One pane carried a bubble in the salvaged glass the size of a pea. The front room looked different, not because it was warmer, though it was, but because light entered without tearing itself on cardboard and plastic. Morning came clearer, evening left more gently. The original east window waited until last. She cleaned it with vinegar water and a soft cloth, working around the old glass as if around a sleeping animal. The sash was fragile but sound. The putty along one side had failed, and 2 glazing points were missing. She did not remove the pane. Instead, she picked away only what had loosened, brushed the edge, warmed a small piece of putty between her palms, and pressed it into the gap with the narrowest knife Hollis owned. Outside the window, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch. It was so near that Sadie could see the black cap, the white cheek, the tiny claws gripping bark. The bird turned its head once, inspecting her through the imperfect glass and the veil of winter light. Its body weighed almost nothing. Its presence altered the whole room. Sadie held the putty knife still until the bird flew. Then she drew the final bevel, slow and clean, along the edge of the oldest pane in the cabin. Late February revealed what smoke and low winter light had hidden. Once the windows held and the floor no longer lifted dust with every step, Sadie began to see the walls clearly. The cabin had not been lined with drywall, not in the older rooms. Beneath the soot behind shelves around the chimney breast, there was horsehair plaster laid over hand-split oak lath, the old kind, uneven and strong where it had been kept dry. In places, fine black hairs showed through the lime like threads caught in bone. Most of it still held. That surprised her. The walls had seemed in those first days like surfaces waiting to collapse. But when she tapped with her knuckle, much of the plaster answered solidly, a low sound joined the lath behind it. Only 3 patches had failed badly, all near the chimney where water and heat had taken turns being unkind. One was the size of a dinner plate, one stretched from the mantel height nearly to the floor. The third, high near the stovepipe, had cracked in a shape like a dry river delta. Hollis had strong feelings about plaster. "Do not smear joint compound over it and call yourself done," he said. "I was not going to." "You looked at the blue bucket." "I looked at the price. That is how bad repairs begin." He took her to a back shelf and pulled down a paper sack tied with twine, yellowed at the top and printed with the name of a supplier that had likely closed before Sadie was born. Inside was horsehair, clean but dry, saved from some job in the 1950s by a man who believed no useful thing should be thrown away merely because its decade had passed. "My father kept this," Hollis said, "for plaster that deserved it." Sadie opened the sack and touched the hair with 2 fingers. It had the strange softness of something that had once moved under weather. The mix required more patience than strength. For the scratch coat, she used lime mortar with washed sand and chopped horsehair, worked through it until the fibres spread evenly and did not clump. Hollis warned her not to overmix once the hair went in. She dampened the exposed lath with a brush, not soaking it, only waking it. Then she pressed the first coat through the gaps so it mushroomed behind the lath and locked as it set. Before it firmed too much, she scored the surface with horizontal scratches using a bent nail. The wall looked worse before it looked better. The brown coat came after the scratch had taken enough set to resist her thumb. 3/8 of an inch, more or less, built out to meet the surrounding plane. The repair manual said 72 hours before the finish coat, longer if cold, and the cabin was always cold at night no matter how faithfully the hearth worked. She waited. She misted the patch lightly when the air dried too quickly near the fire. She shielded it from direct heat with a board set at an angle. The finish coat was only 1/8 of an inch, thin, pale, almost delicate. It required the cleanest sand Hollis could provide and the surest hand she had. Sadie worked it in small arcs with the plaster trowel, feathering the edge into the existing wall. She did not try to erase the line completely. New plaster pretending to be old had a vanity Ruth would not have trusted. But she worked until the repair sat humbly among the older surface, neither proud nor ashamed. When the third patch had taken its finish coat, Sadie stood with the trowel hanging at her side. The room smelled of lime, damp sand, faint smoke, and thawing wood. The walls were mottled, imperfect, marked by age and repair. Yet the worst hollows had closed. The chimney breast looked less wounded. The front room held heat more evenly. She touched the largest patch with 2 fingers once it had firmed. "These patches will hold another 100 years, she said. The sentence did not echo. The cabin received it plainly. Doris Leake owned the cafe with the fogged windows and the chalkboard menu. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her late 50s with cropped silver hair, reading glasses on a chain, and flour always visible somewhere on her apron no matter the hour. Her cafe opened at 5:30 for ranch hands, county workers, road crews, and the kind of older men who considered breakfast a civic institution. The bell above the door had a dull note. The coffee was strong enough to stand beside a person through weather. Sadie had tried at first to avoid becoming known there. A person without money learns to enter public warmth briefly. With apology in the shoulders, she bought coffee when she had coins, sat at the end of the counter and made it last. Doris noticed without seeming to. One morning, while refilling cups at the next table, she placed a paper bag beside Sadie's elbow and kept walking. Inside were 2 biscuits, an apple, and a heel of ham wrapped in wax paper. Sadie waited until Doris returned to the counter. "I cannot pay for this today." Doris took the coffee pot from the burner and looked at it as if judging whether it had been left too long. "Then do not. I need to keep accounts straight. Then write this one down as future candles." "Candles?" Doris wiped the counter with a white cloth already damp at one corner. "When the shop reopens." Sadie looked at her. "It is not a shop. Not yet." After that, the paper bags appeared irregularly and without ceremony, sometimes on the cafe counter, sometimes hanging from the cabin door handle when Sadie returned from the creek. Once tucked under the eave during snow, waited with a jar of soup so it would not blow away. Doris refused payment each time with the same sentence. "In candles when the shop reopens." She did not ask about the hidden chest. She did not ask about debt. She did not ask why a woman with cracked hands and soot at her cuff had chosen to live where demolition notices once went to die. Doris belonged to a class of people who knew that feeding someone could be enough conversation for one day. Caleb Moss came on a red Schwinn bicycle, with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, thin in the unfinished way of boys who have grown upward faster than outward, with wrists showing below his coat sleeves and hair cut poorly at home. His boots were too large and left heavy prints on the track. The bicycle had one chrome fender, one missing fender, and a bell that did not ring so much as click. Sadie first saw him from the front window, pushing the bike through slush. He leaned it against the walnut tree, lifted the maul, and began splitting the rounds Abel had dropped off near the woodpile. He did not knock. He did not announce himself. He set one round on the chopping block, placed his feet lifted, and brought the maul down with a clean stroke that split the wood in two, then another, then another. Sadie opened the door. "Can I help you?" Caleb kept his eyes on the block. "My mother said." "About the wood? About your grandfather?" The word reached her through cold air and landed carefully. "He was not exactly my grandfather," Caleb shrugged, as if adult genealogy were not his concern. "She said he tied my granddad flies when he came back from Vietnam and could not sit indoors. Said he never charged him if the river was low." Sadie stood with one hand on the door. "I cannot pay you much. Not taking money. You brought your own maul. Yours looked bad." He was right. The cabin's hatchet could split kindling, not rounds. Caleb worked for 2 hours that day, stacking split wood in a tidy wall beneath the repaired eave. His rhythm was steady, but not showy. He missed sometimes, reset the round, and tried again. When Sadie brought him coffee, mostly milk and sugar because he was still young enough to prefer kindness sweetened, he drank it in 3 careful swallows. After that, he came twice a week if school and weather allowed. Sometimes he split wood, sometimes he carried creek water before the well could be tested. Sometimes he swept snow from the roof edge with Abel's broom while Sadie stood below and told him not to lean so far. He answered most questions with fewer words than required, yet he noticed things: a loose hinge, a cracked handle, a stack of shingles about to slide. One afternoon, he brought a paper envelope. "My mother said to give you this." Inside was a photograph of an older man kneeling by water, holding a trout and looking not at the fish but at someone beyond the camera. On the back, in blue ink, was written Walt Moss, Gallatin River. Fly by E. Vale. Sadie returned the photograph the next time he came, wrapped in wax paper against snow. "Tell your mother thank you." Caleb nodded and set another round on the block. Reverend Boyd did not enter the cabin until March, but he passed it every morning. He was a tall, narrow man with dark skin, a grey moustache, and a black wool coat brushed nearly white at the shoulders by weather. His church stood nearer the town centre, a modest white building with a bell rope and a basement that smelled of coffee, hymnals, and old linoleum. He walked before breakfast, following the road out past the walnut trees and back, his boots steady, his gloved hands clasped behind him when the footing was good. The first time Sadie saw him, she was carrying ashes to the willow bank. He lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. Morning, morning. He did not ask if she needed prayer. He did not ask if she attended church. He did not ask who had hurt her, what she believed, or whether buying a condemned cabin had been wise. He merely passed the entrance to the track each day and tipped his hat if she was outside. Sometimes, when the wind carried sound just right, she heard him speak as he walked by. 4 words. Keep her through winter. He never said it loudly, he never made a performance of it. The prayer went into the road dust, the snowbank, the cold air, the ditches where last summer's grass lay flattened under ice. Sadie did not know whether heaven accepted prayers addressed on behalf of women who had not asked for them. She knew only that, on the mornings she heard those 4 words, she worked with a steadier hand. In time, the 3 of them became part of the cabin's weather. Doris with paper bags and a future debt measured in candles. Caleb with the red bicycle and the maul, splitting wood under the walnut tree while pretending not to care whether the chimney smoked. Reverend Boyd with his lifted hat and the quiet sentence he left near the road. None of them rescued Sadie. Rescue was too grand a word and usually too impatient. They kept her company in the narrow, practical ways by which people survive a season. Sadie postponed the cellar until February 11th because every sensible part of her preferred not to know what waited below. The hatch was in the back room beneath a hooked rug, so stiff with age it could stand if folded wrong. She had found the iron ring weeks earlier while sweeping, but the work above ground had always been more urgent. Roof, chimney, floor, glass, plaster, things that kept weather from entering, things that kept fire from leaving its proper path. The cellar belonged to the category of necessary dread, and necessary dread can be deferred only so long. On the morning she opened it, the air held a thaw. Water dripped from the eaves in slow, bright intervals. The creek ran louder under its ice. Sadie cleared the bench, lit a lantern, tied a scarf over her hair, and placed a crowbar near the hatch, though she hoped not to need it. The ring lifted reluctantly, and the hatch came up with a breath of air so cold and mineral that it seemed to have been stored beneath stone. 7 granite steps led down. Each step had been cut by hand, dressed enough to be stable but not smooth, and worn slightly at the centre by old passage. The lantern light caught mica in the stone. Sadie descended 1 step at a time, holding the wall with her free hand. The cellar opened into a 12 by 15-foot room with fieldstone walls, a packed earth edge, and a central floor of fitted stone slabs darkened by damp. The ceiling was low but not oppressive. Roots had entered at one far corner and dried there like brown cords. The smell was earth, lime, old apples, rust, and cold water. Against one wall stood empty shelves, not collapsed, only dusty, their pegs intact. Canning jars lined the lowest shelf, most empty, 2 holding buttons, 1 holding square nails, sorted by length. In another corner sat a broken crock, a coil of wire, 3 clay flower pots nested inside one another, and a wooden box with no lid containing mouse-chewed paper that had once wrapped candles. At the centre of the floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It was different from the others. Larger, smoother, rectangular, set so neatly that frost dust had gathered along its edges in clean lines. Carved near one corner was the same craft mark she had seen beneath the horseshoe, the small shape of a tied fly, wings upright, body slender, hook curve exact. The carving was not deep. It did not ask to be noticed by anyone walking quickly. Sadie stood over it with the lantern held low. A person trained by recent discovery might have lifted it at once. She did not because she lacked curiosity, but because the house had taught order, and order had become a kind of respect. The cellar was not dry enough. The slab was too heavy to move safely alone. Whatever lay beneath, if anything did, had waited this long and could wait until she had light, help, and a better reason than hunger for secrets. She left the slab in place. On the stairs going up, her boot struck something under the 3rd step. Not hard enough to trip her, but enough to make a hollow wooden sound where stone should have answered. She set the lantern on the 4th step and knelt. Beneath the overhang of the 3rd granite tread, wedged behind a strip of old lath, was a compact oak box no longer than her forearm. Dust had sealed it into shadow. She worked it loose with the back of the pocket knife and carried it upstairs before opening it. The lid slid, not lifted. Inside lay a brass key and a tin-type photograph. The key was long, darker at the shaft, brighter where it had rubbed against the inside of the box through years of small tremors. Its bow was shaped like the heritage mark, not crudely, but by a careful file, wings at the top, a tapered body, and the suggestion of a hook curve completing the circle. It was too beautiful for a door key and too practical to be jewelry. The photograph had been wrapped in tissue that crumbled at the edge. Sadie held it near the window and watched a young woman appear from the dark plate. She stood in front of this cabin when the front wall looked new enough to startle. Wearing a high-collared blouse and a long skirt, hair gathered back, chin lifted slightly as if the photographer had taken too long. In her right hand, she held a fly-tying vise clamped to a board. Her left hand rested on the maple chest. The face was not Sadie's face. Not exactly. Yet there was a line at the mouth, a slope from cheek to jaw, a steadiness around the eyes that made Sadie lower the photograph and look toward the wavy glass where her own reflection hovered beside creek light. The resemblance was not sentimental. It did not prove destiny. It simply placed her among people who had also stood in hard weather holding small tools. On the back of the tintype, written in faded ink, were the words, Cora Vale, daughter of Silas Vale, age 25, summer of 1903. Sadie read it twice. Then she set the photograph beside Ruth's letter and placed the brass key on the mantel where firelight could find it in the evening. She did not know what it opened. That ignorance did not trouble her. By then, she had begun to understand that not every inheritance must be spent the moment it is found. Some keys are meant to become visible before they become useful. Spring did not arrive by calendar. It came first as sound. The creek grew loud with snowmelt, no longer speaking under ice but over itself, filling the hollow behind the cabin with a cold, muscular rush. Then came the darkening of the track, snow thinning to slush, slush giving way to mud that held boot prints deep and honest. The walnut catkins appeared before leaves, hanging in small green-brown tassels that moved when no other branch seemed touched by wind. By March, the roof patch had survived 3 wet snows. The chimney drew without complaint if the fire stayed modest. The floor had cured to a dark honey near the door and a deeper mahogany around the hearth. The windows held, though the DAP 3-3 putty remained soft enough that Sadie protected the outer edges from hard touches. The plaster dried pale and steady. The cabin was not restored, it was no longer surrendering. People began to use different verbs. Doris said, "When you open." Hollis said, "When you order stock." Abel said, "When the west wall asks." Caleb said nothing. But he stacked wood under the eave straighter than before, as if customers might someday judge a place by its kindling. Reverend Boyd tipped his hat each morning and kept the prayer to 4 words, though snow no longer deserved the whole blame. Sadie did not begin tying that spring. The decision surprised even her. The tools were ready, the bench had been cleaned and oiled, the materials had been sorted into jars with cedar shavings to discourage moths. The vise from the tin type, found later in a lower drawer, beneath a false back far simpler than the chest's hidden compartment, had been freed from rust and mounted near the window. Everything seemed to point toward the first fly. Yet she waited. Not from fear of failing. Failure had become familiar enough to sit beside. She waited because the craft had waited too, and she could feel the wrongness of using it merely to prove that she had earned the room. Ruth's instructions deserved practice before performance. Emmett's voice deserved more than a hurried imitation. A fly tied too soon would be about Sadie. A fly tied carefully might belong to the water. She chose 1 coin from the cloth bundle, a common wheat penny, not rare, not one of the silver dollars, and used it to mark the beginning of a supply order in Hollis's ledger. The coin itself she did not spend. She placed it on the bench while writing the order. Modern hooks, size 12 through 20, black and olive thread, head cement, tippet rings, a small packet of undyed wool, 2 necks of modest hackle, not premium, and plain boxes with wool inserts. She would practice on samples first. Thread base only, tail only, dubbing only. Hackle turns on bare hooks until her fingers remembered proportion. She would tie flies no one would see and cut them apart afterward to learn where her hands lied. She would not reopen the guide service as a museum, nor as a performance, nor as proof that grief had been useful. She would reopen only when the work could stand quietly on its own. April softened the ground. Grass came in narrow green blades near the foundation. The willows put out a haze of yellow. A pair of robins argued over the fence post by the track. The cabin smelled less of damp ash and more of pine, lime wash, beeswax, and thawed earth. In the evenings, Sadie sat at the bench with the lamp lit, not tying yet, only reading Ruth's letter and copying the technical lines into a notebook so the original could rest. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Sadie tied the first fly she allowed to remain whole. Snow had fallen the night before, 3 inches only, enough to brighten the track and hush the creek without burying its voice. The cabin held heat differently by then, not richly, never carelessly, but steadily enough that water did not freeze in the tin cup by morning, and frost stayed mostly outside the windows where frost belonged. The east glass over the bench still warped the view of the creek, bending willow stems into slow waves of light. She began before sunrise. The hook was a size 14 dry fly hook, fine wire, down eye, held in the old vise from the tin type. She laid a thread base from behind the eye to the bend, each wrap touching but not crowding. Tail fibers came from a dun hackle, 3 only, no more. The body was hare's ear mixed with a little rusty brown, dubbed so thinly that the thread still showed through before the turns gathered. 5 open ribs of copper wire, sparse hackle, 2 turns behind, 1 in front, a head no larger than it needed to be. She made mistakes. The first body was too heavy, and she cut it away with the brass scissors. The second tail splayed wider than a natural insect would allow, and she stripped it down to thread. The third fly sat in the vise through a full cup of coffee while she looked at it, not admiring, only judging whether it had any right to be kept. It did not beg for approval. That helped. At last, she tied the finishing knot with the whip finisher, touched the head with varnish thinned as Ruth had instructed, and set the fly in a cork groove to dry. Outside, morning lifted over the creek. The fly was small, careful, brown as winter grass under melt water. It would never make a photograph travel far. It would not startle anyone in a glass case. But in the palm, it held proportion, restraint, and the slight alive disorder that separates imitation from costume. Sadie wrote the date on a card and placed it beneath the fly. Not for sale. She wrote. The cabin around her had become a place of useful surfaces. The front room held a narrow table made from salvaged pine, 2 chairs, a shelf of jars, a black iron stove properly footed and sealed, and a braided rug Doris had brought in exchange, she claimed, for 12 future candles. The hearthstones had been scrubbed but not polished. The plaster patches had dried into the wall as if they had always meant to be there. The floor still held heel marks beneath the workroom stool and darker grain around the fire, and every board told on every season it had survived. The back room had returned to purpose. Above the bench, the hatch notes remained in pencil. Beneath them, Sadie had added no words, only a row of small pegs for tools. Materials sat in labelled drawers, new among old modern spools beside inherited silk, modest hackle beside packets Ruth had kept dry through decades. The maple chest stood on a low shelf, no longer hiding the future but holding patterns, maps and letters in order. The brass key with the fly-shaped bow hung on the mantel from a small nail, visible to anyone who entered but understood by no one who did not ask. For nearly 2 years, it opened nothing. Sadie tried it on the chest, the cellar hatch, the old bench drawers, the front door, the rod tube lock, and a rusted strongbox found behind the outhouse. It fit none of them. Caleb, taller by then and less willing to let his sleeves show his wrists, suggested it might belong to something no longer on the property. Abel said keys outlived locks all the time and should not be blamed for it. Hollis told her not to force brass into ignorance. The answer came after a windstorm. A hard Chinook moved through the valley in late November, stripping loose branches from the walnuts and taking one dead limb down near the track. The next morning, Sadie found bark split along the larger trunk where the horseshoe had been swallowed by the tree. Not broken open exactly, opened enough. Beneath a lifted seam of bark, a small brass plate showed through, greened by age but still shaped with intention. She did not pry it that day. She waited until Caleb could come, because the tree was living and she would not wound it badly from impatience. He arrived with a narrow chisel, a wooden mallet, and the solemn expression of a young man trusted with something older than his certainty. Together they cleared only what was loose. The brass plate emerged as an oval set into a hollow that had been sealed by bark growth and pitch. At its centre was a keyhole nearly hidden by verdigris. Sadie brought the brass key from the mantel. It entered reluctantly, then seated. She turned it with both hands. Inside the walnut trunk was a cavity lined in tin, dry as a cupboard. From it she drew a folded 48-star flag wrapped in oilcloth, the fabric tight and small, not ceremonial in size but carefully kept. Beneath the flag lay a note sealed in a paper packet. The ink faded, yet readable after she carried it inside, and let her hands warm enough to unfold it. The note was dated August 14th, 1945. Its writer was Ruth's mother, Cora Vale, the woman from the tin type, older by then, her hand less upright, but still exact. She wrote that the flag had hung in the cabin window when word came of Japan's surrender, and that she had folded it away for Daniel Keene, who was expected home from the Pacific if God and the Navy allowed. She wrote that no war truly ended in a newspaper, that men brought countries home inside their bodies, and that a house should be prepared to receive silence without demanding explanation. At the bottom, she had written a single instruction. If he cannot speak of what he saw, let the river speak near him. Sadie folded the note along its softened lines and placed it beside Ruth's letter. The 48-star flag did not go on display in the cabin. Display would have made it simpler than it was. She refolded it in acid-free tissue ordered through the library with help from a volunteer archivist in Bozeman, then placed it in a cedar box Hollis built from offcuts and refused to price properly. The brass key returned to the mantel, not as decoration now, but as a completed sentence. The medal found in the tin box had waited too. On May 8, 2025, the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, Sadie carried it to Sunset Hills Cemetery in Bozeman, where rows of veterans' graves stood under spring light, and the grass had only begun to thicken. Daniel Keene's marker was there, modest and military, with dates cut cleanly into stone. Reverend Boyd came with her, not because she asked for ceremony, but because some silences are easier to carry beside another person. She set the medal on the grass before the marker for the length of one prayer. Reverend Boyd removed his hat. He did not improve the moment with many words. When the prayer ended, Sadie lifted the medal, wiped the case with her sleeve, and took it home. The honouring had been done. The keeping remained. The money in the maple chest lasted because she treated it as work already performed by others. In the first year she spent only what was needed to prevent loss: fees, filings, chimney materials, roof repair, glass, taxes, lime inspection costs, and a survey retainer for the parcels marked in Ruth's ledgers. She used 3 coins in the way a person uses witnesses, not currency: the wheat penny on the first supply order, 1 mercury dime taped inside the first repair notebook, and a buffalo nickel placed under the hearthstone after Abel helped reset it level. Later, when the well test required more than she could earn from odd work and candle trades, she added 1 silver $half to the ledger column as a marker, then kept the coin itself sealed with the rest. The bills remained mostly untouched, wrapped, counted, documented, and stored in a bank box after Mrs. Baines insisted that hidden compartments were poor substitutes for insured records. What stayed in the cabin was not the bulk of it, but the meaning of it. Sadie wrote on the inside cover of her account book, for roof, fire, glass, paper, and time. Underneath, in her own hand, she added, The rest is for the next one." That sentence governed every purchase. She did not buy new furniture when repaired furniture would hold. She did not install bright signs when an index card would do. She did not turn the guide cabin into a themed shop with polished nostalgia and high prices for people passing through. If an object had survived honestly, it stayed. If something new was required, she chose it for use first, and appearance only after use had been satisfied. The reopening happened so quietly that even the word reopening felt too large. Doris gave her half a square of corkboard at the cafe between a notice for piano lessons and a card advertising hay for sale. Sadie wrote by hand on a cream index card, "Hand-tied trout flies, Vale guide service bench restored, limited winter tying, local pickup only, leave name with Doris." She pinned one sample beside it, a plain soft hackle, not her best, but honest enough to represent the hand that made it. Doris looked at the card, adjusted it slightly because the pin was crooked, and said nothing until the lunch rush had passed. "Need more than one card," she said. "One is enough. It will not be." By spring, there were 43 names on a mailing list kept in a school notebook Doris had supplied from the cafe office. Not followers, not fans, names, addresses, patterns requested. Rivers fished, an older man in Ennis who wanted soft hackles like his father used, a woman from Livingston teaching her granddaughter to cast, a guide near Big Sky who asked for low-water caddis, dressed sparse enough to offend tourists, and please trout. Mrs. Baines ordered 6 green drakes and wrote on the envelope, "For my late husband's box, not for fishing." Sadie tied slowly. Some weeks she made only a dozen flies, some weeks fewer. She charged enough to pay for materials, heat, taxes, and a little saved labour, but not enough to turn the bench into a factory. Every envelope included a small card with water temperature notes when she knew them, and a line reminding the buyer not to fish spawning beds. Some customers found that unnecessary. They did not order twice. The right ones did. Caleb returned in June with a sign wrapped in a feed sack. By then he had graduated high school and grown into his hands. His red Schwinn had been replaced by an old pickup with one blue door and a toolbox that rattled over every rut. He carried the sign under one arm and leaned it against the front wall without ceremony. "I made this," he said. The board was walnut, not from the living tree, but from the dead limb taken after the Chinook. He had planed it by hand, though not perfectly. The edges retained a little natural curve. The letters were carved deep and painted cream, careful but not machine straight. Vale daughters, hand-tied flies, river maps kept. Sadie read it once. Then again. There were no daughters after Ruth, she said. Caleb looked uncomfortable, which meant he had thought about this longer than he wished to admit. There was Cora. Ruth. You? Maybe somebody later. I am not a Vale. He shifted his weight. My mother says names can be doors or fences. Depends who is saying them. Sadie touched the carved ampersand with her thumb. It was shaped almost like the fly mark. Wings suggested at the top. Curve at the tail. Caleb had noticed more than he ever said. He had made the plural, not as a claim of blood, but as a refusal to let the line narrow itself into disappearance. I cannot pay what this is worth. He gave her the same shrug he had given 2 winters before, when his sleeves were short and his boots too large. My mother said. About your grandfather. They hung it on a Saturday with Abel supervising from below and making disapproving sounds until the sign sat level. Hollis provided black screws. Doris brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Reverend Boyd walked by after the work was done, tipped his hat, and spoke 4 words that had changed only with the season. Keep her through spring. The sign did not make the cabin famous. It made it legible. That summer, a person could come down the track by appointment and find the front door repaired, the windows clean, the creek loud beyond the willows, and a woman at the bench, tying slowly beneath wavy glass. There would be coffee if the pot was on. There would be no guided trips, no overnight packages, no promise of secret water. River maps were discussed only in terms of conservation, access laws, and where not to step. The best places on Ruth's map remained protected by restraint. The parcels became a longer work. Some deeds were clean, some required phone calls, title searches, letters, and courthouse afternoons under fluorescent light. Some agreements could not be enforced but could be honored. With help from a land trust attorney who accepted partial payment in installments and a box of flies for her father, Sadie began the slow process of placing protective language where ownership had left gaps. Not grand conservation, not a press release, just cold seeps, gravel beds, cottonwood banks, and narrow strips of shade kept from becoming less than they were. By the second winter, the cabin had acquired enough routine to feel less like rescue and more like life. Wood stacked in September, chimney checked in October, windows washed before hard frost, materials inventoried before the first snow, letters answered on Sundays, orders tied in the mornings when the light was best, floors oiled lightly near the hearth after Christmas. The cellar checked after deep freezes. The granite slab with the carved mark remained untouched at the center of the cellar floor, brushed clean, respected, and left for a day when lifting it would be an act of care rather than curiosity. Sadie began writing her own letter in January. She used cream paper from the stationery shelf at the post office, not expensive, but thick enough to endure folding. The first draft was too practical, all lists and cautions. The second tried too hard to sound wise and was burned in the hearth before evening. The third she began after a long snow, when the creak was muffled and the bench lamp made a warm circle over the page. She wrote the opening words exactly as Ruth had written them. "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped. The pen rested in her hand. Outside, wind moved through the walnut branches where the sign hung steady under its repaired eave. Inside, the fire kept to its work. The brass key lay on the mantel. Emmett's photograph stood beside Cora's tintype and Ruth's letter. 3 images and a page, making a family less by proof than by keeping. Sadie did not know who the next inheritor would be. A niece of no blood, a tired stranger, Caleb's daughter if he had one some day, a woman not yet born who would arrive cold or ashamed, or merely worn thin by the ordinary losses that seldom make records. The letter could not choose her. It could only wait in a place where careful hands might find it. So Sadie wrote what she knew. She wrote where the roof still needed watching after wet snow. She wrote which window was not to be replaced. She wrote how to warm old feathers near steam, how thin to dress a fly for low water, how not to overcharge a person who needed the river more than a trophy. She wrote that money, if any remained, should move slowly. She wrote the names of those who had helped without asking to be remembered: Mrs. Baines, Hollis Arlen, Doris Leake, Caleb Moss, Reverend Boyd, Abel Roan, the waitress with red wrists whose name she had later learned was Mara. She wrote that abandonment is not always the end of a thing. Sometimes it is only the interval during which greed loses interest. When the letter reached its natural stopping place, she folded it once and did not seal it. Not yet. It was not finished because she was not finished. A true letter to the future had to be revised by seasons. It needed spring flood, summer heat, October smoke, and the particular humility of repairs that failed after seeming complete. She placed the unfinished pages in the maple chest, not under the false bottom, but in the upper tray where any careful person would look. The hidden compartment remained empty except for a note in pencil. You found the first hiding place. Look now for what should not be hidden. Near the closing of that winter, on a night so cold the stars seemed fixed with nails, Sadie carried one split log to the hearth and set it on the coals. Flame moved along the bark slowly, then entered. The cabin gave its familiar responses: a tick in the stovepipe, a settling board near the threshold, the muted sound of the creak beneath ice, the faintest draught along the door where no repair had ever made it perfect. She sat at the bench and tied one fly before bed. A small one. Sparse, 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 spar, sparse, spar, sparse, spar, sparse. Spa, 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 spa. Honest. When it was finished, she held it under the lamp and saw not perfection, but proportion. The kind Emmett had asked of her hands. The kind Ruth had trusted to paper. The kind a house asks when it gives shelter without pretending shelter is easy. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. A fly-tying cabin waits. It waits in the bend of a cold creek, under walnut branches, behind a sign carved by a boy who learned that names can widen if given room. It waits with a roof that sheds most weather, a chimney that draws, windows that hold imperfect light, and a bench where small, careful things are made for water that belongs to no one. It waits without hurry. It has always waited. And in the county clerk's office, inside a narrow receipt drawer beneath carbon copies and parcel forms, Mrs. Luella Baines kept one folded dollar bill under the trout-shaped paperweight. She had meant to deposit it properly, then forgot, then remembered and chose not to. On the back, in her own exact hand, she wrote a line no auditor would ever need. First dollar from the Vale cabin, kept for proof that some places are bought only once, then earned for the rest of a life.